The Forgotten Dawn. Something is profoundly wrong with the story we tell ourselves about human history. We've been taught a comfortable narrative, a simple progression from primitive hunter-gatherers to the sophisticated civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt around 5,000 years ago. We learn that humanity stumbled from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, gradually discovering agriculture, building cities, and finally creating the complex societies that would become the foundation of our modern world. But what if this story is catastrophically incomplete? Beneath our oceans, buried under miles of sand, frozen in Antarctic ice, and hidden in plain sight across every continent, there exists evidence of something that shouldn't exist according to mainstream archaeology. Structures that shouldn't be possible. Knowledge that shouldn't have been available. Civilizations that shouldn't have been there. These aren't fringe theories or wild speculation anymore. These are physical sites, measurable artifacts, and undeniable structures that are forcing scientists to confront an uncomfortable truth. We may not be the first advanced civilization to walk this planet. The evidence sits there, stubbornly refusing to fit into our established timeline. Underwater cities mapped off the coasts of India and Japan, their streets and buildings submerged when sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. That was over 12,000 years ago, during the last ice age, when humans were supposedly living in caves and hunting with stone-tipped spears. There are temples in Turkey built by people who weren't supposed to have the organizational capacity, the architectural knowledge, or even the motivation to create such monuments. These structures predate Stonehenge by 6,000 years and the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000. They were already ancient when Mesopotamia was born. In Bolivia, stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons were cut with such precision that even our modern technology struggles to replicate the feat. The surfaces are so perfectly flat, the angles so exact, that they seem machined rather than carved. Yet they're attributed to cultures that supposedly had only copper chisels and stone hammers. Ancient maps exist that show coastlines as they appeared before the end of the last ice age, depicting land masses with an accuracy that wouldn't be matched again until the 20th century. How did their makers have access to this information? Who conducted the original surveys these maps were copied from? The scientific establishment has largely ignored these anomalies, dismissed them, or forced them into frameworks that simply don't fit. When evidence contradicts the accepted narrative, it's often labeled impossible and set aside. Careers have been destroyed over challenging the orthodox timeline of human civilization. But the evidence keeps mounting. Advanced astronomical knowledge encoded in structures built by people who supposedly didn't know the Earth was round. Sophisticated understanding of mathematics and geometry appearing thousands of years before these concepts were supposed to have been discovered. Engineering techniques that modern builders admit they couldn't reproduce without advanced machinery. The truth is that our planet has gone through multiple cataclysmic events, ice ages that lasted tens of thousands of years, rapid sea level rises that inundated coastal civilizations within a few generations, climate shifts that turned fertile lands into deserts, asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions that plunged the world into darkness and cold. If advanced civilizations rose during the periods between these catastrophes, their traces would be exactly what we're finding now. Most of their achievements would have been destroyed, washed away, or buried under miles of sediment. Only their most impressive monuments, built to withstand eternity, would remain. And that's precisely what we see. The 7 civilizations we're about to explore aren't just interesting historical footnotes. They represent a fundamental challenge to everything we think we know about human development. They suggest that the story of humanity is far longer, far more complex, and far more mysterious than we've ever imagined. These weren't primitive peoples slowly discovering fire and agriculture. The evidence suggests they had advanced knowledge of astronomy, sophisticated mathematical understanding, and engineering capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of later civilizations like Rome or medieval Europe. They mapped the world. They built structures that have endured for over 10,000 years. They understood concepts that we've only rediscovered in the modern era. And then they vanished, leaving behind only tantalizing clues and monuments that whisper of capabilities we're still trying to understand. Science can't explain them because they break all the rules. They exist in time periods where they shouldn't. They demonstrate knowledge that hadn't been discovered yet. They employed techniques that require technology we don't believe existed. Each of these 7 civilizations represents a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that might reveal a dramatically different picture of human history. A history where advanced societies rose and fell multiple times, where knowledge was gained and lost and gained again, where catastrophes reset human progress and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments and memories. The mainstream narrative tells us that civilization is a one-way street, a steady march of progress from primitive to advanced.
But what if it's actually a cycle? What if we're not the first technological civilization, just the latest? What if we're not discovering these ancient mysteries, but rediscovering them? The civilizations we're about to explore existed during periods that modern archaeology considers primitive. They built during the Ice Age, before the invention of writing, before the domestication of animals, before the development of agriculture. They shouldn't exist according to our models of human development. But they do exist. Their monuments stand. Their artifacts remain. Their structures can be measured, dated, and studied. And every time science examines them more closely, the mysteries only deepen. These aren't legends or myths. These are physical realities, carved in stone, sunk beneath the waves or buried under sand and ice. They're waiting for us to ask the right questions, to challenge our assumptions, and to consider the possibility that human history is far stranger and more magnificent than we've been taught. The journey we're about to take will challenge everything you think you know about the past. It will take us to the bottom of the ocean and to frozen wastelands, to jungles and deserts, to mountain peaks and underground chambers. We'll examine evidence that mainstream science struggles to explain and consider possibilities that most archaeologists refuse to acknowledge. We'll look at civilizations that mastered astronomy before humans supposedly knew how to farm. Builders who moved stones that modern cranes can barely lift. Cartographers who mapped continents that wouldn't be explored again for thousands of years. Engineers who achieved precision that challenges our current technology. And we'll ask the most important question of all. If these civilizations existed, if they achieved such remarkable things, why did they disappear? What happened to them? And could the same fate await our own civilization? The answers may be uncomfortable. They may force us to reconsider not just the past, but also our future. They may reveal that human civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the knowledge and achievements we take for granted could be lost far more easily than we imagine. But the truth, however uncomfortable, is always worth pursuing. So let's begin our journey into humanity's forgotten past. Let's explore these 7 civilizations that science can't explain. Let's examine the evidence with open eyes and open minds, free from the dogma
that has constrained archaeological thinking for too long. The story of humanity is about to get a lot more interesting. The sunken cities of the Ice Age. Beneath the waves, in the cold darkness where sunlight fades to black, lie the remnants of a world we've forgotten. A world that existed when the shorelines were hundreds of miles from where they are today. When vast stretches of what is now seafloor were dry land, fertile and inhabited. During the last ice age, which ended approximately 11,700 years ago, sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. The water that now fills our oceans was locked up in massive ice sheets that covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Some of these ice sheets were over 2 miles thick. The numbers are staggering. Global sea levels were between 300 and 400 feet lower than they are today. That means enormous areas of continental shelf that are now underwater were once above the surface. These weren't barren wastelands. They were river valleys, coastal plains, and fertile lowlands where humans could and did live. Think about what that means for human civilization. All of our major cities today are built on coastlines or near the sea. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Shanghai. Throughout history, humans have always built their greatest settlements near water for trade, transportation, and resources. If advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age, they would have built along those ancient coastlines. And those coastlines are now 300 feet underwater. When the Ice Age ended, the melting was catastrophic. Sea levels didn't rise gradually over thousands of years. They rose in pulses, sudden floods that could raise ocean levels by dozens of feet in a matter of decades or even years. Entire coastal civilizations would have been swallowed by the waves, their buildings submerged, their populations scattered or destroyed. If you wanted to hide evidence of ancient civilizations, you couldn't design a better method. The rising seas would have consumed their cities, buried their artifacts under marine sediment, and erased nearly all traces of their existence. Only the most massive structures, the monuments built to last forever, would have any chance of surviving. And that's exactly what we're finding. Off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, lies one of the most controversial underwater structures ever discovered. It's called the Yonaguni Monument, and it has been fighting a battle for recognition since its discovery in 1987. The structure is massive. We're talking about a formation that stretches for over 300 feet in length and rises nearly 90 feet from the sea floor. It features what appear to be terraces, flat platforms, right angles, and even what some researchers describe as a carved face or sphinx-like feature. The debate around Yonaguni is fierce and often bitter. Mainstream geologists insist it's a natural formation, the product of tectonic activity and erosion. They point to the sedimentary rock layers in the area and argue that natural processes could create such features. But other scientists aren't convinced. Dr. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, has spent decades studying the Yonaguni Monument. He's made over 100 dives to the site. His conclusion is unequivocal. This is not a natural formation. It's a man-made structure, or, at the very least, a natural formation that was extensively modified by human hands. The evidence he presents is compelling. There are straight edges and right angles that run for dozens of feet without deviation. There are terraces that stack with perfect regularity. There are apparent staircases, post holes, and what looks like a road encircling the structure. Most tellingly, there are tool marks visible on some of the stone surfaces, parallel grooves that suggest cutting or carving. Natural erosion doesn't create parallel grooves. Waves and currents create random, chaotic patterns. But at Yonaguni, you can see lines that appear deliberately made, patterns that suggest intentional shaping of the stone. The dating is what really makes Yonaguni controversial. The structure is sitting at a depth that places it above water during the last ice age. Based on sea level data, the monument would have been on dry land approximately 10,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. 10,000 years ago. That's 5,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. That's before Mesopotamia, before any civilization that mainstream archaeology recognizes. According to the standard historical narrative, humans at that time were hunter-gatherers, not monument builders. Yet there it sits, massive and undeniable, carved from solid bedrock beneath the waves. But Yonaguni isn't alone. It's part of a pattern of underwater discoveries that are rewriting what we know about the ancient world. Thousands of miles away, off the coast of India in the Gulf of Cambay, another underwater mystery has emerged.
In 2001, marine scientists using sonar to survey the region detected what appeared to be enormous geometric structures on the seafloor, sitting at depths of over 100 feet. The images showed what looked like a massive urban complex. We're not talking about a single building or monument. The sonar revealed what appeared to be foundations, walls, streets, arranged in a grid pattern, and structures covering an area of over 5 square miles. The Indian government's National Institute of Ocean Technology sent expeditions to investigate. They brought up artifacts, pieces of worked wood, pottery fragments, and incredibly, fossilized human remains. They sent samples for dating. The results were shocking. Some of the artifacts dated to over 9,000 years old. One piece of wood returned a date of 9,500 years before present. If accurate, this would make the Gulf of Cambay ruins among the oldest urban settlements ever discovered, predating the Indus Valley civilization by over 5,000 years. The implications are staggering. The Indus Valley civilization, which flourished around 3300 BCE, was already known for its sophisticated urban planning, advanced architecture, and complex society. The idea that an even older, more mysterious civilization existed in the same region thousands of years earlier challenges everything we know about the development of human society in South Asia. Critics have questioned the dating and the interpretation of the sonar images. Some argue that the formations could be natural, that the artifacts might have washed down from other sites, that the dates could be contaminated. The scientific community remains divided, but the controversy itself is revealing. Why is there such resistance to the idea of underwater ruins predating known civilizations? Why do scientists work so hard to explain away evidence that doesn't fit the established timeline? The answer is uncomfortable. If these structures are real, if they are as old as the evidence suggests, then we have to rewrite the entire story of human civilization. We have to acknowledge that advanced urban societies existed thousands of years before we thought possible. We have to confront the possibility that our understanding of human development is fundamentally flawed. And the discoveries keep coming. Off the coast of Cuba, deep-sea explorers have detected what appear to be massive stone structures sitting at depths of over 2,000 feet. Sonar images show formations that look remarkably like pyramids, circles, and other geometric shapes spread across an area of several square miles. At that depth, these structures would have been above water only during an incredibly ancient period, potentially over 50,000 years ago, during an earlier interglacial period. If these are man-made structures, they would predate modern humans' migration out of Africa according to conventional timelines. The Cuban government initially supported expeditions to investigate, but the research has been stalled by funding issues and political complications. The structures remain unexplored, their secrets locked beneath thousands of feet of water and decades of bureaucratic delays. Near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas, divers have explored what's known as the Bimini Road, a half-mile-long arrangement of rectangular limestone blocks that form what appears to be a paved road or harbor wall. The stones are cut and shaped, laid out in a strikingly regular pattern on the seafloor. Discovered in 1968, the Bimini Road has been the subject of intense debate. Skeptics insist it's a natural formation, beach rock that fractured in geometrically regular patterns. Proponents argue that the regularity is too perfect, that some stones show evidence of tool marks, and that the arrangement suggests intentional construction. The dating places the formation's submersion at around 12,000 years ago, during the rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Once again, we're looking at a potential structure from a time period when humans supposedly lacked the capability or organization to build such things. In the Mediterranean, marine archaeologists have discovered numerous underwater sites that push back the dates of human maritime activity and coastal settlements. Off the coast of Greece, submerged ruins have been found at depths suggesting they're from periods earlier than the recognized beginning of Greek civilization. Near Alexandria in Egypt, entire palace complexes and temples have been found underwater, casualties of ancient earthquakes and subsidence. While these are from more recent historical periods, they demonstrate how easily entire cities can be swallowed by the sea, erasing centuries of human achievement in a geological instant. But perhaps the most intriguing underwater discoveries come from the region between India and Sri Lanka known as Adam's Bridge or Rama's Bridge. Satellite imagery shows a chain of limestone shoals and sandbanks stretching across the strait. Some researchers believe these represent the remains of an ancient land bridge that connected the two landmasses when sea levels were lower. Ancient Tamil and Sanskrit texts describe this as a constructed bridge, built in legendary times. Carbon dating of some samples from the structure has returned dates of around 7,000 years old, though this is controversial and disputed. Whether natural or artificial, the formation represents a connection between lands that are now separated by water, a reminder that the geography of the Ice Age world was vastly different from our own. What ties all these discoveries together is their timing. They all date to the end of the last Ice Age, that catastrophic period when the world underwent rapid and dramatic climate change. The ice sheets melted, releasing unimaginable quantities of water into the oceans. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. If civilizations existed during the Ice Age, built along those ancient shorelines, they would have faced an apocalypse. Imagine watching the sea rise, year after year, decade after decade. Watching your ports flood, your coastal cities submerge, your agricultural lands turn to saltwater marshes. The survivors would have been forced inland, carrying with them only fragments of their former knowledge and culture. The legends of a great flood exist in cultures around the world. Mesopotamian texts describe it. The Bible tells the story of Noah. Hindu texts speak of Manu surviving a deluge. Chinese legends describe the Great Flood tamed by Emperor Yu. Native American tribes from Alaska to South America have flood stories. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of the sea rising and swallowing the land. We've always treated these as myths, as primitive attempts to explain natural disasters. But what if they're memories? What if they're the fragmentary recollections of real events? The traumatic cultural memory of civilizations that were destroyed when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose. The underwater structures we're discovering could be the physical evidence of those legends. They could be the remnants of the world that existed before the flood. The lost civilizations that our ancestors tried to preserve in their stories. Modern technology is finally giving us the ability to explore these underwater sites properly. Multibeam sonar can map the seafloor with incredible detail, revealing structures that would be invisible to divers. Remotely operated vehicles can reach depths that humans never could. Underwater archaeology is advancing rapidly, and with each advance, more mysteries emerge. But there are challenges. The ocean is vast, and we've explored less than 5% of the seafloor. Most of our underwater exploration focuses on shipping lanes, resource extraction, and military applications. Very little funding goes toward searching for ancient underwater ruins. Moreover, there's institutional resistance. Universities and archaeological departments have built their reputations on the established timeline of human civilization. Acknowledging underwater cities from 10 or 12,000 years ago would mean admitting that timeline is wrong. It would mean rewriting textbooks, revising theories, and accepting that previous generations of scholars missed something enormous. That's a hard pill for the scientific establishment to swallow. So the evidence gets ignored or dismissed. Underwater structures are labeled as natural formations, despite evidence of artificial construction. Dating that doesn't fit is questioned or rejected. Researchers who push too hard for recognition of these sites find themselves marginalized or ridiculed. But the structures remain. They don't care about academic politics or established narratives. They sit there on the ocean floor, silent testimony to a world we've forgotten. The implications of these underwater civilizations are profound. If humans were building cities and monuments during the Ice Age, then our entire understanding of human development needs revision. We've believed that civilization emerged suddenly, around 5,000 years ago, a rapid flowering of human potential that led to writing, agriculture, and complex societies. But what if that wasn't the beginning? What if it was a rebirth, a recovery from an earlier collapse? What if the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt weren't inventing these concepts but remembering them, reconstructing knowledge that had been lost when the waters rose and the old world drowned? This would explain some of the persistent mysteries of early civilizations. Why did they seem to emerge fully formed, with sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, and engineering already in place? Why do their founding myths speak of gods or sages who taught them the arts of civilization? Could these myths be distorted memories of survivors from the submerged coastal cities, refugees, who carried advanced knowledge to the inland peoples? The Egyptian civilization, for example, appears in history with its major elements already developed. Their hieroglyphic writing, their mathematical and astronomical knowledge, their monumental architecture, all seem to arrive without clear precursors. Egyptian legend speaks of a time before the pharaohs, an age of the gods, when civilization was founded. Could this be a reference to an earlier, pre-flood civilization whose knowledge was transmitted to the Nile Valley? The same pattern appears in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in China. Civilizations emerging with advanced knowledge seemingly from nowhere, with founding legends that speak of a time before, of knowledge granted by gods or inherited from ancestors. What if these weren't legends, but history? What if the gods were the survivors, the refugees from the drowned cities, carrying with them fragments of Ice Age knowledge and technology? The underwater sites we're discovering could be the missing link, the physical evidence that connects the dots between our myths and our history. They could prove that human civilization is far older than we've imagined, that our species has achieved sophistication and then lost it, risen and fallen, not once, but possibly multiple times. And they could warn us about our own future, because the catastrophe that destroyed these Ice Age civilizations could happen again. Climate change, rising sea levels, the melting of polar ice. These aren't theoretical future threats, they're happening now, just as they happened 12,000 years ago.
Our coastal cities, home to billions of people, could face the same fate as those ancient settlements. Perhaps that's the real reason these underwater mysteries matter. They're not just academic curiosities or interesting historical footnotes. They're a mirror held up to our own time, showing us what happens when the climate shifts and the waters rise. They're a warning written in stone and buried beneath the waves, waiting for us to read it before it's too late. The sunken cities of the Ice Age aren't just about the past. They're about the future. They're about understanding the cycles of civilization, the fragility of human achievement, and the power of nature to erase everything we've built. They're about recognizing that we're not as secure as we think, that our cities and our knowledge could be lost just as completely as those of our ancestors. The ocean has kept these secrets for 12,000 years. Now, finally, we're beginning to uncover them. The question is whether we'll learn from them in time, or whether our own cities will join them beneath the waves. Mysteries for some future civilization to discover and puzzle over. The Antarctic Enigma. Antarctica is a tomb of ice. Buried beneath miles of frozen water, crushed under the weight of an entire continent's worth of glaciers, lies a landscape that no human has ever seen. Mountains higher than the Alps, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, lakes the size of small countries, all locked away beneath an ice sheet that has remained frozen for millions of years. Or has it? What if Antarctica wasn't always the frozen wasteland it is today? What if, in the relatively recent past, it was habitable, even hospitable? And what if someone lived there, built there, created a civilization there before the ice came and erased all evidence of their existence? The evidence suggesting this possibility is both tantalizing and deeply controversial. It challenges not just our understanding of human history, but our understanding of Earth's climate history. It forces us to confront maps that shouldn't exist,
geological data that doesn't fit our models, and the uncomfortable possibility that Antarctica holds secrets that could rewrite everything we know. The story begins with a map. In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map that would become one of the most analyzed and controversial cartographic documents in history. The Piri Reis map, as it came to be known, was discovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. And from the moment scholars examined it, they knew something was wrong. The map showed the Atlantic Ocean with remarkable accuracy. The coastlines of South America and Africa were depicted with a precision that shouldn't have been possible in the early 16th century. But it was the southern portion of the map that truly defied explanation. There, at the bottom of the chart, was a landmass that appeared to represent the coast of Antarctica. Not the ice-covered Antarctic coast we know today, but the actual rocky coastline beneath the ice, complete with mountains, bays, and river valleys. This should have been impossible. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, over 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map, and the coastline beneath the ice wasn't mapped until 1949, when a Swedish, British, Norwegian expedition used seismic equipment to determine what lay under the glaciers. Yet there it was on a map from 1513, showing geographical features that wouldn't be confirmed for over 4 centuries. Piri Reis himself noted on the map that he had compiled it from over 20 source maps, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great or even earlier. He was clear that he wasn't creating new information, but collecting and synthesizing older geographical knowledge. But where did that older knowledge come from? Who mapped Antarctica when it was ice-free? And when was it ice-free? According to mainstream geology, Antarctica has been frozen for at least 34 million years, since the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, when the climate cooled dramatically and the Antarctic ice sheet formed. Under this timeline, no human could have seen Antarctica without ice, because humans didn't exist 34 million years ago. But some researchers have suggested an alternative possibility. What if Antarctica wasn't completely frozen until much more recently? What if portions of it were ice-free during the last ice age, or shortly before, during a period when humans definitely existed and were capable of exploration and map-making? This idea isn't as crazy as it sounds. During ice ages, the Earth's climate system behaves in complex and sometimes counterintuitive ways. When massive ice sheets form over the northern continents, they lock up enormous amounts of water and change atmospheric circulation patterns. It's possible that these changes could have created conditions where parts of Antarctica were actually warmer and more habitable than they are today. Some geological evidence supports this possibility. Core samples from Antarctic ice have shown that there have been periodic warming events, even during generally cold periods. These warming events, caused by changes in ocean currents or volcanic activity, could have temporarily melted portions of the ice sheet, revealing the land beneath. There's also evidence of ancient river valleys and erosion patterns beneath the ice that suggest flowing water at some point in Antarctica's past. While mainstream science attributes these to periods millions of years ago, the patterns themselves prove that the continent wasn't always frozen solid. But the Piri Reis map isn't the only ancient map showing impossible knowledge of Antarctic geography. The Oronteus Phineus map, created in 1531, shows the entire Antarctic continent with remarkable detail. It depicts Antarctica as 2 distinct landmasses separated by a waterway, which actually corresponds to the reality beneath the ice, where the Transantarctic Mountains divide the continent into East and West Antarctica. This internal geography of Antarctica wasn't discovered until the International Geophysical Year in 1957 and 58, when seismic surveys revealed the true shape of the land beneath the ice. Yet 400 years earlier, a French cartographer had drawn it with surprising accuracy. The Buach map, created in 1737 by French geographer Philippe Buach, takes this even further. It shows Antarctica completely ice-free, with a waterway dividing the continent. Buach claimed he was basing his map on older source materials, though he couldn't or wouldn't identify them specifically. The Haji Ahmed map from 1559 shows similar features, depicting coastlines and geographical details that match the subglacial topography of Antarctica as we understand it today. These maps present a profound mystery. If they're accurate representations of Antarctic geography, then someone mapped that continent when it was at least partially ice-free. But who? And when? Some researchers have proposed a radical solution to this puzzle. They suggest that an advanced civilization existed during the last ice age, or earlier. A civilization with the capability for transoceanic navigation and sophisticated cartography. This civilization mapped the entire world, including Antarctica, before it froze. When this civilization collapsed, perhaps due to the climate catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, their maps survived in fragments, copied and recopied by later cultures who no longer understood their true origin or significance.
This would explain why ancient cartographers like Piri Reis specifically mention using source maps of great antiquity. They were working from originals created by a lost civilization, preserving knowledge they couldn't have obtained themselves. The implications are staggering. It would mean that human civilization, or at least sophisticated navigation and map-making, existed much earlier than we believe. It would mean that people had explored and charted the entire world thousands of years before Columbus, Magellan, or any of the recognized age of exploration. Critics argue that the maps are misinterpreted, that the supposed Antarctic coastlines are actually distorted representations of South America or other known lands. They point out that many Renaissance maps contain errors and fantastical elements, that cartographers often drew continents they'd heard about but never seen, inventing details to fill in blank spaces. But this criticism doesn't fully explain the specific correlations between these maps and the actual subglacial geography of Antarctica. The probability that multiple independent cartographers would accidentally create maps that match features we only discovered with modern technology seems vanishingly small. There's another piece of evidence that supports the ice-free Antarctica hypothesis, and it comes from an unexpected source: biology. The continent of Antarctica is home to several species that shouldn't be there according to conventional understanding. There are freshwater fish in Antarctic lakes that are more closely related to species found in Australia. Some scientists propose that this was during the Gondwana supercontinent period, over 100 million years ago. But there's another possibility. If Antarctica was partially ice-free more recently, perhaps as recently as 10 or 12,000 years ago, there could have been periods when life could migrate to and from the continent, establishing populations that later became isolated when the ice returned. Ancient human legends add another layer to this mystery. Many cultures have stories of a great southern land, a place of cold and mystery at the bottom of the world. The Greeks spoke of a southern continent called Terra Australis, a landmass they believed must exist to balance the northern continents. They couldn't have seen it, yet the concept persisted for millennia. Aboriginal Australian legends speak of a great land to the south, a frozen place where the ancestors came from in ancient times. These legends are tens of thousands of years old. preserved in one of the world's longest continuous oral traditions. Could they be distorted memories of human contact with Antarctica during a warmer period? In 1929, Admiral Richard Byrd led an expedition to Antarctica that added fuel to these mysteries. During subsequent expeditions in the 1940s and 50s, Byrd made several controversial claims. In his diary, he wrote about discovering warm areas in Antarctica, regions with lakes of warm water and vegetation growing where there should have been only ice. Some of these claims have been verified. Antarctica does have regions of geothermal activity where volcanic heat warms the ice from below, creating caves and even small ecosystems in the otherwise frozen landscape. Lake Vostok, a massive subglacial lake the size of Lake Ontario, maintains liquid water beneath 2 miles of ice due to geothermal heat and pressure. These warm pockets prove that not all of Antarctica is uniformly frozen, that there are microenvironments where life could potentially exist even today. If such areas exist now, they would have been much larger and more extensive during warmer periods in Earth's recent past. But Byrd's most controversial claims came near the end of his life. He spoke of vast areas of Antarctica that were habitable, of discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of history and the planet. He died before he could elaborate on these claims, and his later journals remain classified by the U.S. government, feeding speculation about what he really discovered. Modern satellite imagery has revealed anomalies beneath the Antarctic ice that continue to perplex scientists. Radar scans have detected what appear to be geometric structures, regular formations that don't match natural geological patterns. Most of these can be explained as unusual rock formations or imaging artifacts, but some remain unexplained. One particularly intriguing discovery came from satellite imaging of the Wilkesland region of Antarctica. Beneath the ice, there appears to be a massive circular structure, over 300 miles in diameter. Some scientists believe it's an enormous impact crater from an asteroid that struck during the Permian-Triassic extinction event, the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. But the structure's regularity and some of its features have led others to speculate about more exotic origins. The circular shape, the apparent internal structures visible in gravity and magnetic surveys, and the size all raise questions that haven't been fully answered. There are pyramidal structures visible in satellite images of Antarctica, peaks that protrude from the ice with suspiciously regular triangular faces. Mainstream geology explains these as natural mountain peaks, shaped by wind and ice erosion, a phenomenon that can create pyramid-like forms. But some of these formations show angles and alignments that seem too regular to be entirely natural. Without being able to access them directly, to examine them close up and determine whether they show evidence of artificial construction, we can't definitively say what they are. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, has both preserved the continent for scientific research and limited what kind of exploration can be done there. While ostensibly designed to keep Antarctica free from military activity and resource exploitation, the treaty also restricts access to certain areas and limits what information can be publicly released. This has inevitably led to conspiracy theories about secret discoveries being hidden from the public. While most of these theories are baseless speculation, the fact remains that large portions of Antarctica are unexplored, and much of what has been discovered remains in classified military and scientific databases. What we know for certain is that Antarctica holds enormous amounts of information about Earth's climate history. Ice cores drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet provide a year-by-year record of atmospheric conditions going back over 800,000 years. These cores have revolutionized our understanding of climate change and the history of Earth's atmosphere. But they've also revealed something unexpected. The ice cores show that Earth's climate has undergone rapid, dramatic shifts in the past. Periods of stability lasting thousands of years can end abruptly, with temperatures swinging wildly in just a few decades. The end of the last ice age wasn't a gradual warming, but a series of catastrophic events, with temperatures spiking, oceans rising, and entire ecosystems transforming within a few generations. If human civilizations existed during these periods of rapid change, they would have faced apocalyptic conditions. The world they knew would have been unmade within their lifetimes. Antarctica itself could have gone from a cold but habitable environment to the frozen wasteland it is today in just a few centuries. Imagine a civilization living on the Antarctic coast during a relatively warm period. They've built cities, developed agriculture adapted to the cold climate, created a maritime culture based on the abundant seas. Then the climate shifts. The temperatures drop. Ice begins to accumulate, first in the mountains, then spreading outward across the lowlands. Year by year, decade by decade, the ice advances, destroying everything in its path. The people would have had no choice but to flee. They would have taken to their ships, sailing north to warmer lands, carrying with them whatever knowledge and artifacts they could save. Their maps would have been among their most valuable possessions, showing safe routes to habitable lands. These maps would have been copied, traded, and eventually passed down through generations of sailors and merchants, gradually working their way into the cartographic traditions of later civilizations. By the time Piri Reis compiled his map in 1513, the original source maps might have been copied dozens or hundreds of times, with each copying introducing errors and modifications. But the core geographical information would have remained, a ghostly trace of knowledge from a forgotten age. This scenario is speculative, but it fits the available evidence better than the mainstream explanation that these maps are simply errors or fabrications. It explains how genuine geographical knowledge of Antarctica could have existed in ancient sources. It explains why multiple independent cartographers in the Renaissance period all seemed to have access to similar information about a continent that hadn't been officially discovered yet, and it raises profound questions about what else might be hidden beneath the Antarctic ice.
If there was an ice-free period in Antarctica's recent past, if people lived there and built there, then there should be archaeological evidence. Cities, roads, harbors, monuments, all buried under miles of ice, perfectly preserved in the freezing conditions. Modern ice-penetrating radar can detect structures beneath ice sheets. But Antarctica is vast, and we've only surveyed tiny fractions of it. The ice is constantly moving, flowing like a slow-motion river from the interior toward the coasts. Anything buried in that ice is being crushed and ground to pieces over millennia. But structures carved into bedrock, monuments built to last, might still survive, waiting to be discovered. Climate change is now causing the Antarctic ice sheet to melt at accelerating rates. Glaciers are retreating, ice shelves are breaking off into the ocean, and scientists are deeply concerned about what this means for global sea levels. But for archaeologists and historians, this melting might reveal something else. Evidence of the past that has been frozen for thousands of years. Already melting ice in other parts of the world has revealed ancient artifacts and even human remains. In the Alps, melting glaciers have exposed Roman-era mountain passes and medieval trade routes. In Siberia, thawing permafrost has revealed perfectly preserved mammoths and other Ice Age animals. What might emerge from the Antarctic ice? What secrets has it preserved in its frozen depths? The Antarctic enigma is not just about ancient maps or speculative theories. It's about the fundamental mystery of how much we don't know about our own planet and its history. Antarctica is Earth's least explored continent, its most hostile environment, and potentially its greatest archive of ancient secrets. The ice there is so thick, so heavy, that it actually depresses the bedrock beneath it below sea level. If the ice melted entirely, which would take thousands of years, even under extreme warming scenarios, the continent would slowly rebound upward, like a sponge being released from pressure. The geography that emerged would be different from what we see in our surveys today. That geography might include coastlines that were above water during previous warm periods. It might include river valleys where civilizations could have flourished. It might include sites that could fundamentally change our understanding of human history and capability. For now, Antarctica keeps its secrets. The ice remains, kilometers thick, hiding whatever lies beneath. The ancient maps, tantalizing hints of impossible knowledge, remain controversial and unexplained. The questions persist, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable with current technology and access. But the mystery endures, calling to us from the bottom of the world, challenging us to explain how ancient cartographers knew things they shouldn't have known, to explain where their knowledge came from, and to consider the possibility that human history extends much further back into the frozen past than we've ever imagined. Antarctica isn't just a frozen continent at the end of the Earth. It's a time capsule, a vault of secrets locked away in ice. And as our climate changes and that ice begins to melt, we may finally get answers to questions we've been asking for centuries. Or we may find even deeper mysteries waiting beneath the ice. Proof that the story of human civilization is stranger and more ancient than we ever dared to believe. The advanced astronomers of Göbekli Tepe. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, 9 miles from the city of Şanlıurfa, there is a place that should not exist. It sits on a barren hilltop, exposed to the harsh sun and wind, looking at first glance like nothing more than scattered rocks and dirt. But beneath the surface lies a complex that has shattered every assumption archaeologists held about the origins of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, an unremarkable name for a site that is anything but unremarkable. This is the oldest known temple complex on Earth. Not by a few hundred years, not even by a few thousand years. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates agriculture, pottery, writing, the wheel, and every other marker of civilization that we use to define the Neolithic Revolution. According to the radiocarbon dating, the oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe were built around 9,600 BCE, nearly 12,000 years ago. This was during the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans were supposedly living as hunter-gatherers in small nomadic bands, without permanent settlements, without organized religion, and without the social complexity needed to undertake massive construction projects. Yet there it stands, carved from bedrock and assembled with enormous stone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons. It shouldn't exist. But it does, and its existence demands that we reconsider everything we thought we knew about ancient humanity. The site was first noted in a survey in 1963, but its significance wasn't recognized. The archaeologists who saw the scattered stones assumed they were looking at a medieval cemetery. The site was largely ignored for decades. It wasn't until 1994 that German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized what he was looking at. Schmidt had studied the region and knew that the artificial mound was too regular, too large, to be natural. He began excavations, and within weeks he realized he had discovered something extraordinary. What Schmidt uncovered was a series of massive stone circles, each consisting of enormous T-shaped pillars arranged in rings. These weren't crude standing stones. They were carefully carved monoliths, smoothed and shaped, with intricate relief carvings covering their surfaces. The pillars depicted animals: foxes, boars, lions, bulls, gazelles, snakes, scorpions, and birds, all rendered with remarkable skill and attention to detail. But they also showed stranger things: abstract symbols, geometric patterns, and enigmatic figures that don't match any known animal or object. The tallest pillars stand over 18 feet high and weigh up to 20 tons. They were quarried from the limestone bedrock on the hillside, carved with flint tools, then somehow transported to the construction site and erected in precise positions. This was an incredible engineering feat. Modern engineers examining the site have expressed amazement at the precision of the construction. The pillars fit together with careful alignment. The circles are arranged with geometric accuracy. The entire complex shows planning and organizational capability that shouldn't have existed in the 10th millennium BCE. But here's where it gets truly strange. Göbekli Tepe wasn't built all at once. Over the course of about 3,000 years, from approximately 9,600 BCE to 8,000 BCE, multiple circular structures were built, used, and then deliberately buried before new ones were constructed on top. This wasn't destruction by enemies or natural disasters. The people of Göbekli Tepe carefully, methodically filled in their temples with debris and earth, preserving them perfectly before building new ones. It was an intentional pattern repeated multiple times over millennia. Why would they do this? Why invest incredible effort to build these structures only to bury them and start over? It suggests a cultural or religious practice we don't understand, a belief system that required the periodic renewal of sacred space. Even more mysterious is what happened around 8000 BCE. After 3,000 years of continuous construction and ritual activity, Göbekli Tepe was permanently abandoned. The remaining structures were deliberately buried under tons of fill, and the site was left to return to nature. It would remain undisturbed for 10,000 years, until Klaus Schmidt arrived with his excavators in the 1990s. But the biggest mystery of Göbekli Tepe isn't its age or its construction. It's what it represents about human knowledge in the ancient world. In 2017, researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Sakritsis published a controversial analysis of the carvings at Göbekli Tepe in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry. Their conclusion was startling. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe represent sophisticated astronomical knowledge, including the recording of a catastrophic comet impact that occurred around 10,950 BCE. The researchers focused on one pillar in particular, known as the Vulture Stone, or Pillar 43. This pillar is covered with animal carvings arranged in specific patterns. Using archaeoastronomy techniques, Sweatman and Sakritsis argued that these animals represent constellations, and that the arrangement records the positions of celestial objects during a specific astronomical event. According to their interpretation, the Vulture Stone depicts a comet impact or airburst event that triggered the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, a period of rapid cooling that began around 10,900 BCE and lasted for over 1,000 years. This event is known from ice core and geological data to have been real, a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that disrupted climates worldwide. The mainstream explanation for the Younger Dryas has been that it was triggered by changes in ocean currents, possibly due to the sudden drainage of glacial lakes in North America. But evidence has been mounting for an alternative explanation, that a comet or asteroid impact, or more likely a series of impacts from a fragmented comet, triggered the climate catastrophe. Evidence for this impact hypothesis includes nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, and spherules found in sediment layers dating to the start of the Younger Dryas. These are materials that form during high-energy impacts and aren't found in normal geological processes. If the Göbekli Tepe carvings really do record this event, it would mean that the people who built the site possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They understood celestial mechanics well enough to track and predict the movements of stars and planets. They had developed symbolic systems for recording astronomical data, and they considered this knowledge important enough to carve it in stone for posterity. Critics have challenged this interpretation, arguing that the researchers are seeing patterns that aren't really there, that the animal carvings could represent totems or mythological figures rather than constellations. The debate continues, but the possibility remains intriguing. There's more evidence suggesting astronomical sophistication at Göbekli Tepe. The circular structures themselves are aligned with astronomical precision. The arrangement of pillars tracks solar and stellar alignments, marking solstices, equinoxes, and the rising points of significant stars. The entire site shows evidence of careful geometric planning. The circles aren't random, but follow specific mathematical ratios. The spacing of pillars, the dimensions of the structures, all suggest knowledge of geometry and measurement, far beyond what we'd expect from hunter-gatherers. This raises a fundamental question. Who were these people? How did they acquire this knowledge? And where did they come from? The conventional narrative of human development says that agriculture came first, creating food surpluses that allowed people to settle in permanent villages. These villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. As populations concentrated, social complexity increased, leading to specialized labor, organized religion, and eventually the construction of monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe inverts this entire sequence. Here we have monumental architecture built by people who hadn't yet developed agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers, yet they possessed organizational capabilities that allowed hundreds or thousands of people to work together on a massive construction project lasting generations. Some archaeologists now argue that Göbekli Tepe proves that organized religion came before agriculture, not after. The need to gather for ritual purposes at places like Göbekli Tepe created pressure for people to settle nearby,
which in turn led to the development of farming to support the settled population. This is a complete reversal of the traditional model, and it's being driven by the undeniable evidence at Göbekli Tepe. The site existed before agriculture, yet it required the social complexity we thought only agriculture could produce. But there's another possibility that few mainstream archaeologists want to consider. What if the people who built Göbekli Tepe inherited their knowledge from an earlier civilization? What if they were preserving and transmitting astronomical and architectural knowledge that had been developed long before, during an earlier period of human sophistication? This would explain the seemingly impossible combination of hunter-gatherer lifestyle and advanced knowledge. They hadn't developed this knowledge themselves. They were the descendants of survivors from an earlier, more advanced culture that had been destroyed by the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The Younger Dryas event was genuinely apocalyptic. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within just a few decades. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Sea levels fluctuated wildly. Megafauna went extinct across the Americas and Europe. And, according to the impact hypothesis, this was all triggered by a comet strike that would have devastated any human populations in its path. If an advanced civilization existed before the Younger Dryas, the impact and subsequent climate catastrophe would have destroyed it. The survivors, scattered and reduced to small bands struggling for survival, would have carried with them fragments of the old knowledge, astronomical understanding, architectural techniques, mathematical concepts. All would have been preserved in oral traditions and ritual practices. Göbekli Tepe might represent an attempt by these survivors to preserve and memorialize their lost civilization. The astronomical carvings could be recording the catastrophe that destroyed their world. The sophisticated construction could be their way of proving to future generations that humans had once achieved greatness and could achieve it again. This would explain why Göbekli Tepe appears so suddenly in the archaeological record, with advanced capabilities already in place. It would explain the astronomical knowledge encoded in the structures. And it would explain why the site was eventually abandoned as the survivors' descendants gradually lost the old knowledge and developed new ways of life based on agriculture and settled communities. The excavations at Göbekli Tepe have revealed only a fraction of the site. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys show that the majority of the complex remains buried. There are at least 20 additional circular structures still underground, potentially even larger and more elaborate than those already uncovered. Schmidt estimated that excavating the entire site would take 50 years or more. He died in 2014, and work has continued under new direction, but progress is slow. Each pillar must be carefully uncovered, documented, and preserved. Each carving must be photographed and analyzed. The full extent of Göbekli Tepe's secrets may not be revealed for generations. But even with only a small portion exposed, the implications are staggering. This single site has already forced archaeologists to revise their understanding of when and how civilization emerged. Textbooks are being rewritten. Theories are being discarded. The entire framework for understanding the Neolithic Revolution has been challenged. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. In the years since its discovery, archaeologists have found similar megalithic sites across the region. Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori,
Harbetsuvan Tepesi, and others all show similar construction styles and date to roughly the same period. This wasn't one isolated temple built by a single group of remarkable people. It was a widespread cultural phenomenon, a civilization that existed across a large region of what is now Turkey and the surrounding areas. These people were building stone monuments for thousands of years before any other known civilization. Before the Egyptians, before the Sumerians, before anyone we recognize as part of conventional history. They had astronomy. They had geometry. They had art and symbolism and complex religious beliefs. They could organize labor on a massive scale. They had techniques for working stone that produced results rivaling or exceeding much later civilizations. What they apparently didn't have was writing. At least, not writing that has survived. The symbols carved at Göbekli Tepe might represent a proto-writing system, but they haven't been deciphered. If they recorded their knowledge in perishable materials like wood or leather, those records are long gone. This is the tragedy of studying pre-literate cultures. Without written records, we can only guess at their beliefs, their knowledge, their stories. We're left with stones and bones, artifacts without context, monuments without explanations. But perhaps that's what makes Göbekli Tepe so powerful. It doesn't need writing to convey its message. The stones themselves speak. They say that 12,000 years ago, humans were capable of remarkable things. They say that civilization is older than we thought, more resilient than we imagined, and perhaps more cyclical than we'd like to believe. The astronomical knowledge encoded at Göbekli Tepe suggests that ancient peoples were looking up at the sky with understanding, tracking the movements of celestial bodies, recognizing patterns, and perhaps even predicting future events. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was science, empirical observation, recorded and transmitted across generations. Modern archaeoastronomy has revealed that many ancient monuments incorporate astronomical alignments. Stonehenge, the Egyptian pyramids, Mayan temples, all show evidence of sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. But Göbekli Tepe predates all of these by thousands of years. It suggests that astronomical science is one of humanity's oldest intellectual achievements, practiced and refined long before recorded history. Why would ancient peoples care so much about astronomy? The practical answer is that it helped with timekeeping, with predicting seasons for hunting and gathering, and later for planting and harvesting. But there may have been deeper motivations. Perhaps they saw in the regular, predictable movements of the stars a kind of order and permanence that contrasted with the chaos and uncertainty of life on Earth. Or perhaps they were watching for threats. If the Younger Dryas really was triggered by a comet impact, the survivors would have had good reason to watch the skies with fear and vigilance. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe might be a warning as much as a record, a reminder to future generations that death can come from above without warning. The animal carvings at the site may also have symbolic meanings we're only beginning to understand. In many ancient cultures, animals represented not just themselves, but abstract concepts, qualities, or forces of nature. The foxes, lions, and serpents at Göbekli Tepe might have been part of a complex symbolic language, a way of encoding knowledge that could be transmitted even without writing. Some researchers have suggested that Göbekli Tepe represents the origin point of many later mythological traditions. The motifs and symbols found there appear in various forms in later cultures across the Middle East and Europe. Could the myths and legends of later civilizations have their roots in the actual historical events commemorated at Göbekli Tepe? The flood myths found in cultures worldwide might originate from the real catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age. The stories of a golden age before a great disaster found in Greek, Hindu, and many other traditions might be cultural memories of the pre-Younger Dryas world. The tradition of building stone monuments might trace back to these ancient temple builders. What's clear is that Göbekli Tepe represents a missing chapter in human history, a sophisticated culture that thrived and then vanished before recorded history began. The people who built these monuments possessed knowledge and capabilities that challenge our assumptions about human development. They proved that the march of civilization wasn't a simple linear progression from primitive to advanced. It was more complex, with peaks and valleys, achievements and losses. Göbekli Tepe stands as evidence that humans 12,000 years ago were far more sophisticated than we've given them credit for, and that the story of our species is still being written, still being discovered beneath the dirt and stones of ancient sites. As excavations continue and new sites are discovered, we may finally understand who these people were, where they came from, and what happened to them. But for now, Göbekli Tepe remains an enigma, a testament to human achievement carved in stone, waiting on a Turkish hillside to reveal its final secrets. The advanced astronomers who built this place looked up at the same stars we see today, tracked the same planets, watched the same moon wax and wane. But they saw meaning and pattern where we see random chance. They encoded knowledge where we see decoration. They built to last forever, and they succeeded. After 12,000 years, their message endures, even if we're still struggling to read it. The builders of Pumapunku. High in the Bolivian Altiplano, at an altitude of over 12,000 feet above sea level, lies a collection of stone ruins that defies explanation. Pumapunku. The name means door of the puma in the Aymara language, and it's part of a larger complex near the ancient city of Tiwanaku. At first glance, it looks like a pile of broken stones scattered across a barren landscape, the remains of some long-forgotten structure destroyed by time and earthquakes. But look closer. Pick up one of those stones and examine it. Run your fingers along its edges. Measure its angles, and you'll realize you're looking at something that shouldn't be possible with primitive technology. These aren't rough-hewn blocks chiseled into approximate shapes. These are precision-engineered components, cut with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, fitted with interlocking joints more complex than modern furniture, and polished to a mirror finish that still gleams after more than 1,000 years. The stones at Pumapunku represent an engineering achievement that modern stonemasons openly admit they would struggle to replicate, even with contemporary power tools and computer-aided design. Some of the blocks weigh over 100 tons. They're made from andesite and diorite, stones so hard they rank between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, just below diamond. Cutting and shaping these stones would be difficult today. Doing it with copper chisels and stone hammers, the tools we believe were available to the Tiwanaku people, should have been impossible. Yet, there the stones lie, perfectly cut, precisely angled, impossibly smooth. The official archaeological narrative attributes Pumapunku to the Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished in the region from around 500 CE to 1000 CE. According to this timeline, The site was constructed sometime between 536 and 600 CE, making it roughly 14 to 1500 years old. But there are problems with this dating. Serious problems that suggest Pumapunku might be far older than mainstream archaeology acknowledges, and that the Tiwanaku people might have inherited the site rather than built it. Let's start with the most obvious mystery: the precision of the stonework. The blocks at Pumapunku feature perfectly straight edges, right angles accurate to within minutes of arc, and surfaces so flat that when two blocks are placed together, you can't slide a piece of paper between them. Many blocks include H-shaped grooves, keystone cuts, and complex interlocking joints that allowed the stones to fit together like three-dimensional puzzle pieces. This isn't decorative work. This is functional engineering, designed to create structures that could withstand earthquakes and the test of time. The precision is comparable to modern machining standards, the kind of accuracy you'd expect from industrial manufacturing, not from people working with hand tools. Modern stonemasons who've examined the site express bafflement.
Engineer and architect Jean-Pierre Pratzen spent years studying Andean stonework and attempted to replicate the techniques using the tools available to ancient peoples. He achieved impressive results with smaller stones, but admitted that the largest blocks, especially those at Pumapunku, presented problems he couldn't solve. The surfaces are too flat, the angles too perfect, the hardness of the stone too great for copper tools. Even with diamond-tipped power tools, cutting andesite and diorite to these specifications would be challenging and time-consuming. The idea that it was done with primitive tools strains credibility. Some researchers have suggested that the ancient builders must have possessed advanced tools that we don't know about, perhaps made from materials that have since corroded away, or techniques that haven't been preserved in the archaeological record. But this is speculation without evidence, an attempt to explain the impossible by inventing unknown technologies. Others have proposed that the stones weren't cut at all, but were cast, like concrete, using some kind of geopolymer technique. This theory suggests that the stones are actually a form of ancient concrete, ground rock mixed with binders and poured into molds to create perfectly shaped blocks. There's some evidence supporting this idea. Geopolymer concrete was used in ancient Egypt and Rome, and the technology is feasible with primitive materials. Chemical analysis of some stones from Tiwanaku has shown anomalies that could indicate artificial composition rather than natural rock. But the geopolymer theory has its own problems. Many of the blocks at Pumapunku clearly show the crystalline structure of natural stone, not cast material. And even if they were cast, it doesn't explain how the builders achieved such precision in their molds, or how they created the complex interlocking shapes. Then there's the question of transportation. The nearest quarries for the andesite used at Pumapunku are over 6 miles away. For the red sandstone used in some structures, the quarry is even farther, across Lake Titicaca on the Copacabana Peninsula, over 50 miles away. Moving 100-ton blocks across miles of rough terrain at high altitude, where the thin air makes physical labor exhausting, would have required thousands of workers and sophisticated logistics. There's no evidence of roads capable of supporting such weights, no records of the organizational effort that would have been necessary. The Tiwanaku civilization was certainly capable of impressive feats. They built extensive agricultural systems, constructed ceremonial centers, and created a complex society that dominated the region for centuries. But the precision engineering at Pumapunku seems beyond their documented capabilities. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Tiwanaku people didn't build Pumapunku? What if they found it,
recognized its significance, and incorporated it into their own ceremonial complex. Archaeological excavations have revealed that the site underwent multiple phases of construction and modification. Different architectural styles are layered on top of each other, suggesting that various cultures used and rebuilt the site over long periods. The most precisely cut stones appear to be the oldest, with cruder construction added later. This pattern is the opposite of what we'd expect. Normally, civilizations become more sophisticated over time, with later constructions showing improved techniques and greater precision. At Pumapunku, the most advanced engineering appears to be the earliest, with subsequent cultures unable to match the quality of the original construction. It's as if the site was built by a more advanced civilization, then later occupied by peoples who couldn't replicate the original techniques, but did their best to maintain and modify the structures using cruder methods. Carbon dating and pottery fragments from the site provide dates in the 500 to 1000 CE range, supporting the conventional timeline. But these dates only tell us when people were using the site, not when the most precisely cut stones were originally carved. If Pumapunku was built earlier and later reused by the Tiwanaku, the dating would show the period of reuse, not the original construction. Some researchers have suggested that Pumapunku could be far older than acknowledged, possibly dating back thousands of years to a pre-Tiwanaku civilization, about which we know almost nothing. This would explain the superior engineering of the oldest stones and the apparent decline in technique over time. There's geological evidence that supports an older date. The region around Tiwanaku shows signs of having once been at a much lower altitude. Fossilized marine creatures from Lake Titicaca are found at elevations suggesting the lake was once at sea level, with the entire altiplano subsequently lifted thousands of feet by tectonic forces. If Pumapunku was built when the region was at a lower elevation, it would have been far easier to construct. The climate would have been more temperate, the air thicker and easier to breathe, and the surrounding area more fertile and capable of supporting a large population. The Andes Mountains are still rising, pushed upward by the subduction of the Nazca Plate beneath the South American Plate. This process is ongoing, but operates over millions of years, too slowly to affect human timescales. However, the region is also seismically active, with major earthquakes capable of causing rapid elevation changes. Some geologists have proposed that catastrophic seismic events periodically reshape the altiplano, potentially raising or lowering elevations by dozens or even hundreds of feet in a matter of hours or days. If Pumapunku was built during a period when the plateau was lower, such an event could explain its current altitude and the difficulty of its construction. But this remains speculative. What isn't speculative is the precision of the stonework itself, which can be measured and verified by anyone who visits the site. The most impressive blocks at Pumapunku are the H blocks, massive stones carved with precise H-shaped grooves on their top surfaces. These grooves are cut with perfectly vertical walls and flat bottoms, forming channels that once held metal clamps to join blocks together. The accuracy of these cuts is remarkable. The walls of the grooves are parallel to within fractions of a millimeter across their entire length. The corners are sharp and clean, not rounded or chipped as you'd expect from hammer and chisel work. The surfaces are smooth and polished. Modern archaeologists believe these grooves were cut using stone hammers and copper chisels, gradually pecking and grinding away the rock. Experimental archaeology has shown this method can work, but it's slow, labor-intensive, and doesn't explain the precision of the final result. A skilled craftsman with modern tools might take days or weeks to cut a single groove to these specifications. How long would it take with primitive tools? How many craftsmen would be needed to create the hundreds of precisely cut blocks found at the site? And how did they maintain such consistency across all the blocks, ensuring that components manufactured separately would fit together perfectly when assembled? The only logical answer is that they had some kind of standardization system, templates, or patterns that ensured uniformity. This implies a level of planning and organization more typical of industrial production than ancient handicraft. Some of the stones at Pumapunku also feature perfectly drilled holes, some going completely through blocks several feet thick.
These holes are perfectly circular, with smooth walls and uniform diameters from entry to exit. Drilling through andesite to create such holes would require steady pressure, precise alignment, and considerable time even with modern diamond core drills. The conventional explanation is that the holes were drilled using copper tubes spun by hand, with sand used as an abrasive. This technique can work, but achieving the precision seen at Pumapunku would be extremely difficult. Any deviation in pressure or angle would cause the hole to wander or become elliptical rather than perfectly circular. Then there's the question of scale. Some individual blocks at Pumapunku weigh over 130 tons. The largest stone block at the site, now broken, is estimated to have weighed over 400 tons when intact. These aren't decorative elements, they're structural components. Foundation stones meant to support massive buildings. Moving stones this size requires serious engineering. Modern construction equipment can handle such loads, but it requires powerful cranes, hydraulic lifts, and reinforced transport vehicles. Ancient peoples would have needed enormous manpower, complex rope and pulley systems, and techniques that aren't documented in any surviving records. The Incas, who came to dominate the region centuries after Tiwanaku's collapse, had legends about Pumapunku and Tiwanaku. They didn't claim their ancestors built these sites. Instead, they attributed them to the gods or to ancient giants who lived before the Inca. They treated Tiwanaku as a sacred site of great antiquity, a place built by beings who possessed powers beyond human capability. These legends shouldn't be dismissed as mere mythology. They might preserve genuine historical memory, cultural recollections of encountering ruins so advanced they seemed supernatural.
If the Inca found Pumapunku already ancient and abandoned, they would naturally attribute it to divine or superhuman builders, unable to conceive how ordinary humans could have created such marvels. Spanish chronicles from the colonial period describe Tiwanaku and Pumapunku as already ruined and mysterious when the conquistadors arrived. The local Aymara people who lived in the area had no traditions of building the sites and regarded them with superstitious awe. They were already forgotten, their builders nameless, their purpose obscure. What could have caused such a complete break in cultural continuity? Why would knowledge of these sites be lost so thoroughly that even neighboring peoples had no memory of who built them or when? The most likely answer is catastrophe. Something happened that destroyed or dispersed the builders, erasing their culture so completely that only their stonework survived. The Tiwanaku civilization itself collapsed around 1000 CE, possibly due to a severe drought that made their agricultural systems unsustainable. But if Pumapunku predates Tiwanaku, its builders might have faced an even earlier catastrophe. The Altiplano has a harsh climate even today. At 12,000 feet elevation, the air is thin, temperatures are cold, and agriculture is difficult.
only hardy crops like potatoes and quinoa can grow. Sustaining a population large enough to build Pumapunku would have required extensive agricultural infrastructure and sophisticated resource management. Any disruption to the climate, any prolonged drought or cold snap, could have been devastating. The population would have declined, skills would have been lost, and eventually, the civilization would have collapsed, leaving only its monuments behind. There's evidence of catastrophic flooding in the region's past. Lake Titicaca has shorelines that show water levels once significantly higher than today.
If the lake suddenly rose, either due to glacial melting or tectonic activity blocking its drainage, it could have inundated coastal settlements and destroyed agricultural lands. Pumapunku itself shows signs of violent destruction. The massive blocks are scattered chaotically, as if tossed by some enormous force. Some researchers suggest this was caused by earthquakes, the seismic shocks breaking apart the structures and flinging blocks dozens of feet from their original positions. But earthquakes don't usually throw 100-ton blocks around like toys. To achieve the kind of displacement seen at Pumapunku would require extraordinary seismic forces, or perhaps something else entirely. Some have speculated about tsunamis from Lake Titicaca, massive waves generated by underwater earthquakes or landslides that swept across the site with devastating power. If such a catastrophe occurred, it could explain why Pumapunku appears unfinished. Many of the precisely cut blocks show no signs of weathering or wear, as if they were never actually incorporated into completed buildings. It's possible the construction was interrupted by disaster, with the builders fleeing or perishing before they could finish their work. The site might be a frozen moment, a snapshot of a civilization caught in the middle of an ambitious building project when catastrophe struck. The blocks lie where they fell, perfectly cut and ready for assembly, but never completed, testament to ambitions that were never fulfilled. What were they building? The scattered blocks suggest a structure of enormous size and complexity, possibly a temple or ceremonial center that would have rivaled or exceeded anything else in the ancient world. But without knowing how the blocks fit together, we can only speculate about the original design. Some researchers have attempted to reconstruct Pumapunku using computer modeling, trying different configurations of the blocks to see what structures might emerge. The results suggest a multi-level platform or pyramid, possibly with courtyard areas and multiple chambers. But these reconstructions are speculative, educated guesses rather than definitive answers. The truth is that we don't know what Pumapunku was meant to be. We don't know who built it, when they built it, or how they achieved such precision. We don't know why it was destroyed or abandoned. It remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, a testament to capabilities we can measure but not explain. Modern engineers and architects who visit Pumapunku come away humbled. They recognize engineering excellence that rivals contemporary standards. They see solutions to structural problems that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of physics and materials science. They encounter precision that would be difficult to achieve even with modern technology. And they ask the same questions archaeologists ask. Who were these people? How did they do this? And what happened to them? The conventional answers feel inadequate. The idea that the Tiwanaku civilization, using only copper tools and human labor, created these perfectly engineered stone components strains credibility. The precision is too great, the scale too massive, the technical sophistication too advanced. Something doesn't add up. Either we're missing critical information about ancient technologies and techniques, or we're wrong about who built Pumapunku and when. Perhaps both. The builders of Pumapunku possessed knowledge we've yet to rediscover. They could work stone with precision we struggle to match. They could move masses we'd need advanced machinery to shift. They could design and execute construction projects of staggering ambition and complexity. Then they vanished, leaving behind only scattered stones and unanswered questions. Their names are lost. Their knowledge is gone. Only their monuments remain, standing in silent testimony to capabilities we're still trying to understand.
Pumapunku isn't just an archaeological site. It's a challenge to our assumptions about ancient peoples and their capabilities. It's proof that sophistication existed where and when we didn't expect it. And it's a reminder that we still have much to learn about the true history of human civilization. The lost civilization of the Sahara. The Sahara Desert is the largest hot desert on Earth, a vast expanse of sand and rock stretching across North Africa for over 3.5 million square miles. It's one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, where daytime temperatures can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and rainfall is measured in millimeters per year rather than inches. It's hard to imagine anything living there, let alone thriving. The Sahara seems timeless and unchanging, an eternal wasteland where life cannot gain a foothold. But this is an illusion. The Sahara hasn't always been a desert. In fact, for most of human history, it was anything but. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Not just dotted with occasional oases, but genuinely green, covered with grasslands, forests, rivers, and lakes. It was a fertile paradise teeming with wildlife, home to elephants, giraffes, hippos, crocodiles, and countless other species. And it was home to humans, who built a civilization we're only beginning to understand. The evidence for this green Sahara is overwhelming and undeniable. It comes from multiple scientific disciplines: geology, paleoclimatology, archaeology, and even ancient art. Together, they paint a picture of a lost world buried beneath the sand. A world that was destroyed by climate change so severe it transformed an entire continent. The geological evidence is stark. Across the Sahara, scientists have found ancient lake beds, river valleys, and alluvial deposits where water once flowed. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar have revealed vast underground aquifers, remnants of ancient river systems that once crisscrossed the region. These weren't small streams. Some of these ancient rivers were massive, comparable to the Nile or the Congo. The Tamanrasset River, which dried up around 5,000 years ago, flowed from the mountains of Algeria across the entire width of the Sahara to the Atlantic Ocean, a distance of over 1,500 miles. Lake Megachad, which existed during the African humid period, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, approximately 150,000 square miles. Today, Lake Chad is a fraction of that size, a shallow remnant surrounded by desert. Core samples from these ancient lake beds show sediment layers containing pollen, fossilized seeds, and organic material from savanna grasses, acacia trees, and other vegetation. The fossil record shows bones from species that require substantial water and vegetation to survive. Elephants, rhinoceros, buffalo, and aquatic animals like crocodiles and hippos. This wasn't a marginal environment supporting a few hardy species. This was a thriving ecosystem, rich in biodiversity and resources. And archaeological evidence shows that humans took full advantage of it. The most dramatic evidence comes from rock art found throughout the Sahara.
In caves, on cliff faces, and on isolated rock formations scattered across the desert, ancient artists left behind tens of thousands of images depicting their world. These aren't crude stick figures. Many are sophisticated artworks showing remarkable skill and attention to detail. They depict animals with anatomical accuracy, humans engaged in complex activities, and scenes of daily life rendered with artistic sensibility that rivals any ancient art tradition. And they show a world completely different from the Sahara we know today.
The earliest rock art in the Sahara dates back over 12,000 years, to the end of the last ice age. These ancient images show large animals, elephants, giraffes, rhinoceros, and big cats. They show humans hunting with bows and arrows, gathering plants, and living in what was clearly a verdant landscape. As we move forward in time, the rock art becomes even more remarkable. Between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, during the peak of the Green Sahara period, the art shows pastoral scenes, cattle herding, farming, settlements, and complex social activities. The most famous examples come from the Tassili Najjar Plateau in southeastern Algeria, where over 15,000 rock art images have been documented. The paintings show cattle in enormous herds, some with elaborate patterns painted on their bodies, suggesting they were domesticated and valued. There are scenes of people dancing, swimming, fishing, and engaging in rituals. But there are also images that are harder to explain. Strange figures that don't look quite human, wearing what appear to be elaborate costumes or suits. Geometric patterns and symbols whose meanings are lost. Scenes that seem to depict events or beliefs we can't interpret without knowing the culture that created them. One particularly controversial set of images shows what some researchers call the swimmers. Human figures rendered in what appears to be a swimming position, arms and legs outstretched. These images are found in areas that are now the driest parts of the Sahara, hundreds of miles from the nearest water. They date to around 8,000 years ago, when the region was still green and lakes dotted the landscape. The swimmers aren't alone. Throughout the Saharan rock art, there are numerous depictions of boats, fishing, and water-related activities. These images appear in places where no water has existed for thousands of years, proof that the climate was radically different when they were created. The rock art provides a timeline of environmental change. The oldest images show big game animals and hunter-gatherers. Then we see the emergence of pastoralism, with cattle herding becoming dominant. Later images show the arrival of horses and eventually camels, animals adapted to increasingly arid conditions. The final images, created as the desert advanced, show survival in a harsh environment, with fewer animals and more desperate scenes. Then the art stops. Around 4,000 years ago, people abandoned the Central Sahara. The rock shelters fell silent. The last artists either died or fled to regions where water still existed. The desert had won. But before the desert came, before the climate shifted and the rains failed, there was a civilization in the Sahara. Not a primitive culture eking out survival, but a sophisticated society, with agriculture, animal husbandry, permanent settlements, and artistic traditions. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive evidence of this civilization. At Gobero in Niger, archaeologists discovered a vast cemetery,
containing over 200 burials spanning thousands of years. The graves show a society with complex burial practices, social hierarchies, and artistic sensibilities. The earliest burials date to around 10,000 years ago and show hunter-gatherer populations who lived along the shores of a large lake. The skeletons indicate these people were well-nourished and healthy, benefiting from abundant resources. Later burials, from around 6,000 years ago, show pastoral peoples who herded cattle and created intricate grave goods. These graves contained jewelry, pottery, and tools of remarkable craftsmanship. Some burials included elaborate arrangements of bodies, with adults buried holding children, or positioned in ways that suggest complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. But around 4,000 years ago, the burials stop. The cemetery was abandoned as the lake dried up and the desert advanced. The population that had thrived there for thousands of years was gone, scattered, or extinct. Similar sites have been found throughout the Sahara. At Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, archaeologists discovered stone circles and megalithic structures dating back over 7,000 years. These weren't simple arrangements, but carefully planned ceremonial centers aligned with astronomical events. One circle at Nabta Playa appears to have been an astronomical device, marking the summer solstice and tracking the movement of specific stars. It predates Stonehenge by over 1,000 years and demonstrates sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. The site also contains carved stone sculptures, pottery, and evidence of permanent settlements. The people of Nabta Playa weren't nomads. They had established communities, practiced agriculture and animal husbandry, and developed religious or ceremonial practices important enough to warrant the construction of monuments. What's particularly intriguing is that Nabta Playa's astronomical alignments match certain features of ancient Egyptian temple architecture. Some researchers have proposed that the people of Nabta Playa might have been ancestors or precursors to the ancient Egyptian civilization, forced to migrate to the Nile Valley as the Sahara dried. This raises a fascinating possibility. Could the sudden emergence of sophisticated Egyptian civilization around 3100 BCE be explained by the arrival of refugees from the drying Sahara? People who brought with them advanced knowledge of astronomy, architecture, and social organization developed over thousands of years in the Green Sahara. Egyptian mythology speaks of a time before the pharaohs, when the gods walked among men and taught them the arts of civilization.
Could these myths be distorted memories of real people? Saharan refugees who seemed advanced and sophisticated to the simpler Nile Valley populations they encountered? The timeline fits. The Sahara began its transformation into desert around 5,000 years ago, with the process accelerating around 4200 BCE during a global climate event known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. This was a period of severe drought that affected civilizations across the Middle East and North Africa. In the centuries following this event, we see the collapse of several civilizations and the emergence of others. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia collapsed. The Old Kingdom of Egypt went through a period of upheaval. And in the Indus Valley, there were major population movements and changes. All of these changes coincide with the final desiccation of the Sahara. As the last water sources dried up, as the grasslands turned to sand, the Saharan populations would have had no choice but to migrate. They would have moved toward permanent water sources, the Nile, the Niger River, the coast. These migrations would have brought Saharan peoples into contact with other populations, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. The knowledge and skills developed during thousands of years in the Green Sahara would have been transmitted to these other peoples, accelerating their own development. This could explain why so many advanced civilizations seem to emerge suddenly around 5,000 years ago. They weren't starting from scratch. They were inheriting and building upon knowledge preserved and transmitted by Saharan refugees. But what was lost in this transition? If the Saharan civilization was as sophisticated as the archaeological evidence suggests, what knowledge died when the desert claimed their homeland? The rock art gives us glimpses, but raises more questions than it answers. Some of the symbols and images are utterly mysterious.
There are geometric patterns that might represent maps, calendars, or astronomical charts. There are enigmatic figures that could be gods, spirits, or cultural heroes whose stories are lost forever. There are images that seem to show ritual practices or ceremonies whose purposes we can't fathom. Scenes of groups engaged in activities that look important and meaningful, but which we can't interpret without the cultural context. One of the most intriguing aspects of Saharan rock art is its distribution. The images are found across enormous distances, spanning thousands of miles. Yet there are common themes, similar artistic styles, and repeated motifs that suggest cultural connections across this vast region. This implies a level of communication and interaction that we don't usually associate with ancient peoples. The Saharan cultures weren't isolated tribes. They were part of a connected network, sharing ideas, beliefs, and artistic traditions across a vast geographic area. How did they maintain these connections? The Green Sahara was crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with lakes, making water transport relatively easy. But there must also have been overland routes, trading networks that connected distant communities and allowed for the exchange of goods and ideas. Archaeological evidence supports this. Artifacts found in Saharan sites include materials that originated hundreds or thousands of miles away. Shells from the Mediterranean or Atlantic coasts appear in inland sites. Stone tools are made from rock that must have been traded from distant quarries. Pottery styles show influences from multiple regions. This was a sophisticated trade network spanning a huge area, suggesting political organization, economic systems, and cultural cohesion at a scale comparable to later civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia. But unlike those civilizations, the Saharan culture left no written records. We don't know what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, what their myths and beliefs were, or how they understood their world. All we have are their artifacts and their art, silent remnants of a lost world. The transformation of the Sahara from grassland to desert was driven by changes in Earth's orbital parameters. Variations in the planet's tilt and orbit, known as Milankovitch cycles, affect how much solar radiation different parts of Earth receive and when. These cycles operate over tens of thousands of years and are a primary driver of ice ages and climate changes. Around 15,000 years ago, orbital changes caused the African monsoon to strengthen, bringing increased rainfall to North Africa. The Sahara bloomed into the Green Sahara, a process that took several thousand years. Then, around 6,000 years ago, the orbital parameters shifted again. The monsoon weakened, rainfall decreased, and the Sahara began to dry. This process was gradual at first, but accelerated around 5,500 years ago. Within just a few centuries, vast areas went from habitable grassland to barren desert. The speed of this transformation would have been devastating for the people living there. Within a single human lifetime, the world they knew would have changed beyond recognition. Lakes dried up, rivers ceased to flow, grasslands turned to sand, animals died or migrated away, and humans were forced to follow or perish. This wasn't a gradual adaptation over many generations. This was a catastrophe happening in real time, forcing immediate decisions about survival. The archaeological record shows rapid abandonment of sites, with people leaving behind tools, pottery, and other possessions as they fled. Some populations tried to adapt, moving to the last remaining water sources and eking out survival in increasingly marginal conditions.
The rock art from this period shows smaller, less elaborate images, suggesting declining populations and diminishing resources for artistic production. Eventually, even these last holdouts had to leave. The Sahara became what it is today, a vast desert supporting only small nomadic populations clustered around scattered oases. But the memory of the Green Sahara persisted. Arab and Berber traditions speak of a time when the desert was fertile, when rivers flowed and cities thrived. These stories were long dismissed as mythological, but archaeological discoveries have proven they contain genuine historical memory. The ancient Greeks and Romans knew about the Sahara's past. Classical writers described the interior of Africa as containing fertile regions and great rivers, not just endless desert. They heard stories from North African peoples about ancestors who lived in places that were now barren wasteland. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described the Garamantes, a Saharan people who lived along dried-up river valleys and maintained sophisticated irrigation systems to capture underground water. These people were likely the last descendants of the Green Sahara civilization, clinging to survival using knowledge passed down from their ancestors. The Garamantes built underground aqueducts called fogaras, some extending for miles to tap distant aquifers. This technology demonstrates sophisticated hydraulic engineering, knowledge that probably originated during the Green Sahara period, when water management was crucial for agriculture. Modern archaeology has revealed Garamantian cities and fortifications in what is now the most desolate part of the Libyan desert. These weren't primitive settlements, but urban centers with monumental architecture, suggesting a level of social organization and resources that seems impossible in such an environment.
The Garamantes persisted until around 500 CE, when even their underground water sources failed and their civilization collapsed. They were probably the last link to the Green Sahara civilization, the final bearers of knowledge and traditions stretching back thousands of years. With their disappearance, the connection was broken. The full story of the Saharan civilization was lost, surviving only in fragments, scattered rock art, buried ruins, and fading legends. But the ruins remain, buried beneath the sand, waiting to be discovered. Modern remote sensing technology is revealing structures hidden under the desert, sites that haven't been seen by human eyes for thousands of years. Satellite imagery shows ancient river courses, lake beds, and what appear to be settlement patterns across vast areas. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys are detecting buried structures without excavation, providing non-invasive ways to map archaeological sites. These technologies are revealing that the Sahara contains far more ancient sites than previously imagined. most still unexcavated and unstudied. Each discovery adds to our understanding, but also reveals how much we don't know. The Saharan civilization probably covered an area larger than any other ancient culture. It persisted for thousands of years. It developed sophisticated technologies and complex societies, and we know almost nothing about it. What were their cities like? How was their society organized? What were their beliefs and values? What knowledge did they possess? Did they develop writing, mathematics, astronomy? We have hints from the rock art and artifacts, but no definitive answers. The Green Sahara civilization represents one of the greatest lost chapters in human history. It proves that advanced cultures can exist for millennia and then vanish so completely that later generations don't even know they existed.
It demonstrates that climate change can destroy civilizations regardless of their sophistication or capabilities, and it serves as a warning. The Saharan people couldn't control the climate that destroyed their world. The orbital mechanics that brought the rains and then took them away operated on scales beyond human influence. But they experienced the consequences just as surely as if they had caused the change themselves. Their cities are buried. Their knowledge is lost. Their names are forgotten. Only the desert remains, vast and indifferent, concealing the ruins of a world that once thrived, but could not survive the changing climate. Somewhere beneath the sand lie answers to questions we're only beginning to ask. Somewhere under those endless dunes are cities, libraries of rock art, monuments to gods we've never heard of, and tombs of people who lived entire lives in a world we can barely imagine. The lost civilization of the Sahara waits beneath the desert, patient and silent, ready to reveal its secrets to anyone willing to brave the heat and sand to uncover them. And as climate change once again transforms our world, perhaps we should pay attention to what happened when the Sahara died. Because the people who lived through that catastrophe learned the hard way that no civilization is permanent, and that nature can reclaim in decades what took millennia to build. The Pacific Ring Megalith Builders. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles, nearly a third of Earth's surface. Within this vast expanse lie over 25,000 islands, scattered across distances so immense that ancient peoples supposedly couldn't have crossed them. Yet they did cross them. Somehow, thousands of years ago, people navigated these enormous distances, colonized remote islands separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean, and established settlements in some of the most isolated locations on Earth. And on many of these islands, they built monuments, massive stone structures that shouldn't exist given the limited populations, the absence of large trees for moving heavy stones, and the apparent lack of advanced technology. Monuments that raise the same questions we've encountered at other ancient sites. How, why, and when? The Pacific megalith builders created a ring of mystery stretching from Easter Island in the east to the islands of Micronesia in the west, from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south. These weren't isolated incidents of monument building, but part of a pattern suggesting connections, shared knowledge,
Or perhaps inheritance from a common ancestor culture? Let's start at the most famous and most mysterious, Easter Island. Rapa Nui, as the island's original inhabitants called it, sits in the southeastern Pacific, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass. It's one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, a tiny triangle of volcanic rock just 14 miles long and 7 miles wide. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen arrived on Easter Sunday in 1722, he found an island covered with nearly 900 massive stone statues, the Moai, standing on platforms all around the coastline. Many had toppled, some had been defaced, and the island's population was small and impoverished, living in a degraded environment with few trees and limited resources. The contradiction was obvious. How could such a small, isolated population have created these monuments? The Moai are enormous, carved from volcanic tuff at the Rano Raraku quarry. The average Moai stands about 13 feet tall and weighs around 14 tons. But some are much larger. The tallest Moai ever erected was 33 feet tall and weighed 82 tons. And in the quarry itself, there's an unfinished Moai that, if completed, would have been over 70 feet tall and weighed around 300 tons.
The conventional explanation is that the Rapa Nui people arrived on the island around 1200 CE, perhaps as late as 1400 CE, and began carving the Moai as ancestor figures, or representations of clan chiefs. They transported them from the quarry using log rollers, erected them on platforms called ahu, and topped them with stone topknots called pukao. This massive construction project required resources, particularly trees for rollers and rope. Archaeological evidence shows that Easter Island was once heavily forested, covered with giant palm trees. The Rapa Nui cut down these trees for construction and agriculture, eventually deforesting the entire island. This environmental catastrophe led to societal collapse, warfare, and population decline. The Moai toppled, either destroyed by rival clans or abandoned as the society that created them fell apart. It's a cautionary tale about resource management and environmental destruction, and it's become a parable for what could happen to Earth if we don't manage our resources sustainably. But there are problems with this narrative, serious problems that suggest the story of Easter Island is more complex than the conventional version acknowledges. First, the dating is controversial. Radiocarbon dates for the earliest Polynesian settlement on Easter Island have ranged from 400 CE to 1200 CE, with ongoing debate about which dates are accurate. Some researchers argue for earlier settlement, others for later. The uncertainty matters because it affects how much time the Rapa Nui had to create the Moai, and whether they had time to both build the monuments and destroy their environment. Second, the method of transporting the Moai remains unclear, despite extensive experimental archaeology. Researchers have demonstrated that the statues could be moved using various techniques: horizontal transport on log rollers, vertical rocking back and forth, or even upright walking using ropes. But these experiments use replicas weighing a few tons, not the massive originals weighing dozens of tons. Moving an 80-ton statue across miles of rough terrain without modern equipment is a formidable challenge.
The largest moai that was successfully erected had to be transported over 10 miles from the quarry. With limited resources and a small population, this represents an enormous investment of labor and time. Third, the precision of some moai is remarkable. They're not crude carvings, but sophisticated sculptures with detailed features, carefully shaped bodies, and distinctive individual characteristics. The stone was worked with such skill that some surfaces are nearly polished. This level of craftsmanship suggests a well-developed artistic tradition, not the work of people who had just arrived on an isolated island. And then there's Ahu Vinapu, a platform on the southern coast that has baffled researchers since its discovery. The stonework at Vinapu features precisely fitted blocks with curved and straight edges that interlock without mortar. The similarity to Inca stonework is striking, and has led some researchers to suggest connections between Easter Island and South America. Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer famous for the Kon-Tiki expedition, argued that Easter Island was settled from South America rather than from Polynesia. He pointed to Ahu Vinapu as evidence, along with the presence of South American plants on the island, including the sweet potato, which is native to South America but was cultivated throughout Polynesia before European contact. Modern DNA evidence has largely disproven Heyerdahl's theory, showing that the Rapa Nui are Polynesian. But recent genetic studies have revealed something intriguing. The Rapa Nui genome contains small amounts of Native American DNA, suggesting contact between Polynesians and South Americans occurred before European contact, possibly around 1200 CE.
This raises questions about the extent of ancient Pacific navigation and whether there were cultural exchanges across the ocean that we don't fully understand. Could the stoneworking techniques at Ahu Vinapu have been influenced by South American visitors or shared from a common source? Easter Island's mysteries don't end with the moai. There's also the Rongo Rongo script, a system of glyphs carved on wooden tablets. Discovered in the 19th century, Rongo Rongo remains undeciphered despite numerous attempts. We don't know what language it represents, whether it's true writing or mnemonic symbols, or what information it records. What makes Rongo Rongo particularly frustrating is that most of the tablets were destroyed by missionaries who considered them pagan artifacts. By the time scholars recognized their importance, only a few dozen tablets survived, too few to provide the statistical patterns needed for decipherment. If Rongo Rongo is writing, it might have contained the history of the island, explanations of the moai, and answers to the mysteries that perplex us today. Instead, it's another lost language, another body of knowledge erased before we could learn from it. But Easter Island isn't the only Pacific island with megalithic mysteries. 2,000 miles to the west lies Nan Madol, perhaps the most enigmatic ancient site in the Pacific. Nan Madol sits off the coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia, a complex of nearly 100 artificial islets built from massive basalt columns and boulders. The islets are connected by canals, creating what's been called the Venice of the Pacific. The site covers over 200 acres and contains the remains of palaces, temples, tombs, and residential structures. The construction is extraordinary. The walls are built from columnar basalt, hexagonal stone logs that look almost manufactured. These columns, which formed naturally when lava cooled and cracked, were somehow transported from quarries on the opposite side of Pohnpei, a distance of over 25 miles. The largest stones at Nan Madol weigh over 50 tons.
They were stacked without mortar to create walls up to 50 feet high. Some of the structures contain an estimated 750,000 tons of basalt. The engineering and logistics required to build Nan Madol dwarf what should have been possible for a small island population. Local legends say that Nan Madol was built using magic, that the stones flew through the air and positioned themselves through supernatural power. These legends have been dismissed as mythology, but they reflect the genuine mystery of how such construction was accomplished. The conventional dating places Nan Madol's construction between 1200 and 1500 CE, making it contemporary with or slightly later than Easter Island's Moai. But some researchers question these dates, arguing that the main structures could be older, possibly built on or incorporating earlier constructions. What we know is that Nan Madol was the ceremonial center of the Sautelur dynasty, the rulers of Pohnpei. The site served as a royal city, a religious center, and a necropolis where the nobility were entombed. At its peak, it might have housed 1,000 people, a huge population concentration for a Pacific island. But around 1628 CE, Nan Madol was abandoned following the collapse of the Sautelur dynasty. The site was left to the jungle, and within generations, local people avoided it, considering it haunted or cursed. When European explorers first documented Nan Madol in the 19th century, it was already ruined and overgrown, its history forgotten. The similarities between Nan Madol and other Pacific megalithic sites have led some researchers to propose connections.
Could there have been a network of ancient Pacific cultures, sharing building techniques and cultural practices? Or do these similarities reflect independent development, different cultures finding similar solutions to similar challenges? Moving north, we encounter the megaliths of the Mariana Islands. On Tinian, Rota, and other islands, there are latte stones, massive limestone pillars topped with hemispherical capstones called tassa. These structures served as foundation pillars for ancient houses, raising buildings above the ground. The largest latte stones are enormous. The Taga House site on Tinian once featured pillars standing 15 feet tall, with capstones weighing over 11 tons. Moving and positioning these stones would have required sophisticated engineering, especially the capstones, which had to be lifted 15 feet in the air and precisely placed on the pillars. The Chamorro people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Marianas, built the latte stones before European contact. Spanish colonization beginning in the 17th century devastated the Chamorro population through disease and violence, and much of their traditional knowledge was lost. Modern Chamorro don't know exactly how the latte stones were built, or what techniques their ancestors used. In Hawaii, ancient Hawaiians built massive heiau, temple platforms constructed from fitted stone blocks. Some heiau are enormous, like Pu'ukohola heiau on the Big Island, which measures over 200 feet long and 100 feet wide, built from thousands of basalt stones carried by hand from valleys miles away. Hawaiian legends speak of the Menehune, a race of small people who built structures overnight using supernatural abilities. While clearly mythological, these legends might preserve memories of earlier inhabitants with advanced building skills, or of construction techniques that seemed magical to later generations. In Tonga, the Ha'amonga Amaui Trilithon consists of 3 massive coral limestone slabs, 2 standing vertically, with a third placed horizontally across the top, like a lintel. Each slab weighs over 30 tons. According to Tongan tradition, it was built around 1200 CE by the Tui Tonga dynasty, but its purpose remains unclear. Some researchers have suggested it served as an astronomical observatory, with notches in the stones marking solar alignments. Throughout French Polynesia, in the Marquesas Islands, archaeologists have discovered numerous tohua, ceremonial platforms featuring massive stone tikis, carved pillars, and precisely fitted stone walls. Some of these structures rival anything found on Easter Island or at Nan Madol in their sophistication and scale. What ties all these sites together is their megalithic construction, their precision stonework, and their purpose as ceremonial or religious centers. They represent an enormous investment of labor and resources by relatively small island populations, and they demonstrate capabilities that seem disproportionate to the societies that supposedly built them. The conventional explanation is that these monuments reflect the values of hierarchical Polynesian and Micronesian societies, where chiefs commanded the labor of their people to build structures that reinforced their power and prestige. Monument building served political and religious purposes, demonstrating the chief's ability to marshal resources and labor. But this doesn't fully explain the technical sophistication. How did isolated island populations develop advanced stoneworking techniques? How did they transport multi-ton stones without draft animals, wheels, or metal tools? How did they achieve precision fitting and astronomical alignments? Some researchers have proposed that these cultures inherited knowledge from earlier peoples, possibly from a now-lost civilization that once dominated the Pacific.
This hypothetical civilization would have had advanced navigation, sophisticated engineering knowledge, and the organizational capacity to build large-scale structures. As this civilization declined or was destroyed, perhaps by climate change or natural disasters, its survivors scattered across the Pacific, carrying fragments of their knowledge to various islands. This would explain the similarities in construction techniques across vast distances. It would explain why island populations seem to have knowledge disproportionate to their size and isolation. And it would explain legends common throughout the Pacific of ancestral gods or heroes who taught people the skills of civilization. The theory of a lost Pacific civilization is controversial and lacks direct evidence. No sunken cities have been found. No artifacts that clearly predate known Polynesian and Micronesian cultures. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially in an ocean as vast as the Pacific, where underwater exploration has been extremely limited. Sea levels have risen over 300 feet since the end of the last ice age. Any coastal settlements from that period would now be underwater, potentially preserved, but inaccessible to standard archaeology. The continental shelves around Pacific Islands are steep, meaning most submerged land is at depths that make exploration difficult and expensive. There are legends throughout the Pacific of sunken lands, lost islands, and ancestral homelands now beneath the waves. The Maori of New Zealand speak of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland from which their people came. Hawaiians have similar legends of Kahiki. These are generally understood as referring to other Pacific islands, but some versions describe lands that sank or were destroyed. Could these legends preserve memories of actual islands or land masses that existed during lower sea levels? At the end of the Ice Age, there were more and larger land masses in the Pacific than exist today.
Some current island groups would have been connected into larger land masses. There would have been islands that are now completely submerged. If people lived on these now sunken lands, if they developed sophisticated cultures there, their descendants might preserve memories of these places even after they vanished beneath the waves. The other major mystery of Pacific megalithic cultures is their navigation. How did ancient peoples cross thousands of miles of open ocean to discover and settle these remote islands? Without compasses, without charts, without the instruments we consider necessary for ocean navigation, they accomplished feats that European sailors wouldn't match until the age of exploration. Polynesian navigation was based on intimate knowledge of stars, ocean swells, bird behavior, and subtle environmental cues. Navigators underwent years of training to memorize star paths, learn wave patterns, and recognize signs of land beyond the horizon. This knowledge was passed down through generations in oral traditions and practical training. But even with this knowledge, the colonization of the Pacific required remarkable skill and courage. Easter Island, the most remote inhabited island, would have required a voyage of at least 2,000 miles from the nearest Polynesian island. The chances of finding such a small target in the vast Pacific seem astronomically small. Yet the Polynesians succeeded. This suggests their navigational capabilities were even more advanced than we understand. Some researchers propose that ancient Pacific peoples had knowledge of longitude and latitude, that they could determine their position at sea with remarkable accuracy using techniques we've lost or never discovered.
Computer simulations of Pacific colonization show that random voyaging, even with basic navigation, could eventually lead to the discovery of most islands. But the pattern of actual settlement suggests intentional exploration, not random chance. Islands were discovered and settled in a logical progression, with populations expanding outward from origin points in predictable patterns. This implies coordination and communication across vast distances. It suggests that Pacific cultures maintained contact between islands, that knowledge of new discoveries was transmitted back to home populations, and that subsequent voyages could be planned rather than accidental. Such a system would require advanced maritime technology, sophisticated navigation, and complex social organization. It would require a level of capability that challenges our understanding of ancient Pacific peoples. The megalithic structures scattered across the Pacific stand as testimony to these capabilities. They prove that ancient island populations achieved remarkable things with limited resources. They demonstrate that isolation didn't prevent the development of sophisticated cultures. And they challenge us to reconsider what we think we know about ancient human capabilities. The Pacific Ring megalith builders created monuments that have endured for centuries, structures that continue to baffle researchers and inspire wonder. They navigated an ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface, discovering islands separated by thousands of miles of open water. They developed cultures rich in art, mythology, and tradition. And then, like so many ancient civilizations, they declined. Their populations fell due to resource depletion, warfare, or environmental changes. Their building traditions ended. Their navigational knowledge was partially lost. European contact brought diseases that devastated island populations, and colonial domination that destroyed traditional cultures. What remains are the stones. Moai, staring out to sea from Easter Island. The basalt columns of Nan Madol slowly crumbling into the Pacific. Latte stones standing sentinel in the Marianas. Temple platforms in Hawaii and Tonga. Stone tikis in the Marquesas. Each one represents thousands of hours of labor, generations of accumulated knowledge, and beliefs we can only dimly understand. They stand as proof that the Pacific isn't just an empty expanse of water, but was once crisscrossed by seafaring peoples who built, explored, and thrived in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The mysteries remain. The connections between sites separated by thousands of miles. The techniques used to work and move massive stones. The purposes of structures whose functions have been forgotten. The extent of ancient Pacific navigation and exploration. The possibility of lost lands now beneath the waves. As research continues, as new sites are discovered and old ones re-examined, we may find answers, but for now, the Pacific Ring megalith builders keep their secrets, their monuments standing as silent sentinels, watching over an ocean that still holds mysteries we've only begun to explore. The pre-flood valley civilizations. Water is civilization's lifeblood. Throughout human history, every major civilization has emerged along rivers or near abundant water sources. Mesopotamia flourished between the Tigris and Euphrates. Egypt rose along the Nile. The Indus Valley civilization thrived on the banks of the Indus and its tributaries. China's earliest cultures developed along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. This pattern isn't coincidental. Water provides everything early civilizations needed: drinking water, irrigation for agriculture, transportation routes, fishing, and fertile soil deposited by annual floods. River valleys are civilization incubators, providing the resources necessary for populations to grow, settle, and develop complex societies. But here's the problem. The river valleys where we find the earliest known civilizations all contain evidence suggesting they weren't the first. Beneath the cities we know, buried under layers of silt and sediment, there are traces of earlier settlements, older structures, and artifacts that push back the dates of civilization far beyond what mainstream archaeology acknowledges. These pre-flood valley civilizations existed during a period when the world was radically different. Sea levels were lower, coastlines extended miles beyond their current positions, and many of today's river valleys were deeper and narrower. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose catastrophically, these early civilizations were destroyed, their settlements buried under silt deposited by massive flooding events. What remains are fragments, anomalous artifacts found at depths that shouldn't contain human-made objects, structures that predate the supposed beginning of civilization, and legends found in cultures worldwide speaking of a great flood that destroyed the world and forced humanity to start over. Let's begin in the Indus Valley, home to one of the world's oldest and most mysterious civilizations. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, flourished from approximately 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. At its peak around 2500 BCE, it was the most extensive ancient civilization, covering an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The Harappan cities show remarkable sophistication. They had planned layouts with straight streets on a grid pattern, advanced drainage systems, standardized brick sizes, and multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing. The major cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa housed tens of thousands of people and demonstrated urban planning far ahead of their time. But here's what's strange. The Harappan civilization appears suddenly in the archaeological record, already fully developed. There's no clear progression from primitive villages to sophisticated cities. The earliest Harappan sites already show advanced features: standardized measurements,
sophisticated architecture, and complex social organization. It's as if the civilization emerged fully formed, with all its capabilities already in place. This pattern is inconsistent with the normal development of cultures, which typically show gradual evolution from simple to complex. Excavations at Harappan sites have revealed something even more puzzling. Beneath the known Harappan cities, there are earlier layers containing artifacts and structures that don't fit the conventional timeline. These deeper levels show different pottery styles, different architectural techniques, and sometimes more sophisticated features than the Harappan layers above them. At Mohenjo-Daro, excavations have been limited because the water table is high, and the deepest levels are flooded. But the excavations that have reached the lowest levels found them already below the current water table, meaning the city was built in a location that would have been underwater or marshland if the water table was at its present level when construction began. This suggests that either the water table has risen significantly since the city was built, or the city was constructed during a period when water levels were much lower. Both scenarios imply that the earliest phases of Mohenjo-Daro are much older than the conventional dates suggest. There are also anomalous artifacts. In some of the deeper strata at Harappan sites, archaeologists have found objects that show technological sophistication exceeding what should have existed at those dates. Precisely drilled beads made from carnelian and other hard stones, requiring techniques that shouldn't have been available. Metal objects with compositions suggesting advanced metallurgy.
Seals with undeciphered script that might represent an even earlier writing system than the known Indus script. The Indus script itself remains undeciphered despite over a century of attempts. We have thousands of inscribed seals and tablets, but the texts are short, and without a bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone, we can't crack the code. If we could read the Indus script, it might reveal the true history of the civilization, including information about its origins and predecessors. Some researchers have suggested that the Harappan civilization was founded by refugees from an earlier culture destroyed by climate catastrophe or flooding. This would explain the sudden appearance with advanced capabilities already developed. The Harappans weren't starting from scratch, but rebuilding, carrying with them knowledge from their lost homeland. Where was this homeland? One possibility is the now submerged continental shelf off the coast of India. During the Ice Age, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower, exposing vast areas now underwater. The Gujarat coast, the Konkan coast, and the areas around Sri Lanka all would have had extensive lowlands that are now beneath the sea. Archaeological surveys of these underwater regions have been limited, but what's been found is tantalizing. We've already discussed the Gulf of Cambay discoveries, the underwater structures that yielded artifacts dating to 9,500 years ago. If those dates are correct, there was a sophisticated culture in the region thousands of years before the Harappan civilization. Could the Harappans be descendants of this earlier culture? When sea levels rose and the coastal settlements were flooded, the survivors might have migrated inland, establishing new cities along the Indus River. They would have brought with them the knowledge and techniques developed over millennia, allowing them to create advanced cities seemingly overnight. This would explain not just the Harappan enigma, but also similar patterns in other river valley civilizations. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian civilization emerges around 4000 BCE, with impressive capabilities already in place. They had writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, and complex social organization from their earliest known period. The conventional explanation is that these capabilities developed during a pre-literate period,
for which we have limited evidence. But this is an assumption, not proven fact. Sumerian legends speak of the Abzu, the underground waters or the deep, from which civilization emerged. They had stories of 7 sages called the Apkallu, who came from the sea before the flood, and taught humanity the arts of civilization. These sages were described as fish-like beings, which scholars interpret as priests wearing fish costumes, but could also be misunderstood descriptions of people who came from across the sea. The most famous flood story comes from Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains an account of a great deluge that destroyed the world, with one man, Utnapishtim, surviving by building a boat. This story predates the biblical flood narrative and appears in various forms throughout Mesopotamian literature. But it's not just a story. There's geological evidence for catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations at Ur, Uruk, and other Sumerian cities have found thick layers of water-deposited clay with no human artifacts, separating earlier occupation layers from later ones. These flood layers date to different periods at different sites, suggesting multiple severe flooding events. The most significant of these floods occurred around 2900 BCE, coinciding with a period of major climate change. But there are also traces of earlier, more extensive flooding, particularly layers that appear to date to the end of the Ice Age, around 10,000 BCE.
If there were settlements in the Mesopotamian lowlands during the Ice Age or shortly after, they would have been destroyed when sea levels rose and the Persian Gulf expanded. The Gulf's shoreline was once over 100 miles further south than it is today, exposing a vast plain through which the Tigris and Euphrates flowed before emptying into the sea. This plain, now under water, would have been prime territory for early settlements. It had freshwater rivers, fertile soil, and access to both inland and coastal resources. If a civilization developed there during the lower sea level period, its remains now lie beneath the Persian Gulf, inaccessible to standard archaeology. Recent surveys of the Gulf using bathymetry and seismic profiling have detected what appear to be river channels, ancient shorelines, and possibly artificial structures on the seafloor. These features are at depths corresponding to Ice Age sea levels, suggesting they date to a period when the Gulf was much smaller or partially dry. Could there have been a civilization in the Persian Gulf basin before it flooded? Could this civilization be the source of the Sumerian flood legends and the origin of the advanced knowledge that suddenly appears in early Mesopotamia? The pattern repeats in Egypt. The Egyptian civilization appears around 3100 BCE, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaoh. But from its beginning, Egyptian civilization demonstrates sophisticated capabilities. Hieroglyphic writing, monumental stone architecture, advanced mathematics and astronomy, complex religious beliefs, and elaborate artistic traditions. Where did all this knowledge come from? The conventional answer is that it developed during the pre-dynastic period, from roughly 6000 to 3100 BCE, as Egyptian culture gradually evolved. But the archaeological evidence for this gradual evolution is surprisingly thin. The pre-dynastic period shows relatively simple cultures, and then suddenly, around 3100 BCE, we get the full package. Pyramids within a few generations, complete hieroglyphic writing, and sophisticated art. Egyptian legends speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an ancient era when gods ruled Egypt and established civilization.
The Egyptian king lists include divine and semi-divine rulers who supposedly reigned for thousands of years before the historical pharaohs. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses these as mythology, but some researchers wonder if they might contain distorted historical memories. The Nile Valley has changed dramatically over millennia. During wetter periods, the Sahara was green, and numerous rivers flowed through what is now desert. The Nile itself has shifted its course multiple times, and vast areas now desert were once habitable. Earlier civilizations could have existed in these regions and then vanished when the climate changed. There's also the controversy over the age of the Sphinx. While mainstream Egyptology dates the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, some researchers argue it's much older based on weathering patterns. The Sphinx shows evidence of water erosion, deep vertical fissures that appear to have been caused by heavy rainfall over extended periods. But the Sahara has been arid for thousands of years. The last time the region experienced the kind of rainfall that could cause such erosion was during the African humid period, which ended around 5,500 years ago. If the water erosion on the Sphinx dates to that period, the monument would be at least 7,500 years old, predating the Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. This theory remains controversial, with critics arguing that other forms of erosion could explain the patterns. But the possibility remains that the Sphinx and perhaps other structures at Giza predate the dynastic period and were inherited by the Egyptians from an earlier culture.
In China, the earliest known civilization is the Shang dynasty, which emerged around 1600 BCE. But recent discoveries keep pushing back the dates of sophisticated culture in China. The Yangshao culture, dating to 5000 BCE, shows advanced pottery and agricultural systems. The Hongshan culture, from 4700 to 2900 BCE, built megalithic structures and created intricate jade artifacts. And beneath these known cultures, there are hints of something older. At Sanxingdui, in Sichuan province, archaeologists discovered a cache of bronze artifacts unlike anything else in early Chinese archaeology. The bronzes include enormous masks with exaggerated features, strange standing figures, and objects that don't match any known Chinese style. The Sanxingdui culture flourished around 1200 BCE, but seems to have had no predecessors and no successors. It appears suddenly, produces remarkable artifacts, and then vanishes completely. The style is so unique that some researchers have wondered if it represents contact with cultures from outside China or inheritance from an earlier, unknown civilization. The Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys have been densely inhabited for thousands of years, making archaeology difficult. Every time the rivers flood, they deposit new layers of sediment, potentially burying earlier sites. Ancient cities could lie beneath dozens of feet of silt, undiscovered because no one has dug deep enough. Chinese legends speak of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, mythical rulers who reigned before the Xia dynasty, China's first historical dynasty. These legendary figures were credited with teaching humanity agriculture, medicine, writing, and other civilized arts. Like similar legends elsewhere, they might preserve memories of actual people or cultures from an earlier period. The global pattern is consistent. River valley civilizations appear suddenly with advanced capabilities. They have legends of floods and earlier ages. They show evidence of knowledge that seems to come from nowhere. And beneath their cities, there are often traces of earlier occupation that don't fit the conventional timeline. The most straightforward explanation is that these civilizations didn't start from scratch. They were founded by survivors from earlier cultures destroyed by the catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. These survivors carried with them knowledge, techniques, and cultural memories from their lost homelands. When the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose by over 300 feet. This didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to be catastrophic for coastal populations. In some periods, sea levels rose by several feet per decade, enough to visibly advance within a human lifetime. Imagine living in a coastal city during this period. Every year the sea is noticeably closer. Over your lifetime, you watch the ocean advance miles inland. Your grandparents' houses are underwater. The harbors have to be rebuilt further inland, repeatedly. Agricultural lands become salt marshes. Fresh water sources are contaminated by seawater intrusion. Eventually, the city becomes untenable. The population has to abandon the coast and move inland, to higher ground, to river valleys that haven't yet been flooded. They bring whatever they can carry: tools, seeds, livestock, and most importantly, knowledge. These refugees would have been the survivors of sophisticated coastal civilizations, people with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about agriculture, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, and social organization. When they established new settlements in the river valleys, they would apply this knowledge, creating what appear to be suddenly advanced civilizations. This explains the pattern we see: civilizations emerging fully formed, with capabilities that seem too advanced for their supposed age. They weren't starting from scratch. They were rebuilding, trying to recreate what they had lost. It also explains the flood legends found in virtually every culture worldwide. These aren't myths or religious parables. They're cultural memories of real events, the catastrophic flooding that destroyed the Ice Age world and forced humanity to start over. The Mesopotamian flood, the biblical deluge, the Hindu legend of Manu surviving the flood, Chinese flood myths, Native American flood stories, Australian Aboriginal accounts of the sea rising, Pacific Island legends of submerged lands. They all describe the same thing: a time when the waters rose and the old world was drowned. Modern geology confirms that this flooding happened. We know sea levels rose catastrophically at the end of the Ice Age. We know this would have inundated vast areas of coastal lowlands. We know it would have destroyed any settlements in those areas. What we don't know is how sophisticated those settlements were. Were they simple villages of hunter-gatherers, or were they cities of an advanced civilization? Did the people who lived there possess knowledge that was lost when they were forced to flee? Knowledge that we're only now rediscovering. The pre-flood valley civilizations suggest that human history is cyclical rather than linear. We haven't been on a steady upward trajectory from primitive to advanced. Instead, we've risen and fallen multiple times, achieving sophistication and then losing it when catastrophes strike. The river valley civilizations we know, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus, China, might not be the original civilizations, but the second or third iterations. They might be rebuilt versions of earlier cultures that were destroyed by the flood, carrying forward fragments of ancient knowledge in the form of legends, techniques, and half-remembered wisdom. Beneath the known cities lie older layers, waiting to be excavated. Beneath the seas lie drowned settlements, waiting to be explored. And in the legends and myths that every culture preserves, there are memories of what came before, waiting to be properly understood. The pre-flood valley civilizations are the missing link in human history, the cultures that bridge the gap between the Ice Age and the historical period. They're the explanation for how civilization could appear so suddenly, so fully developed, in multiple locations around the world. They prove that we're not the first advanced civilization, just the latest. And they warn us that what happened to them could happen to us. Climate catastrophes destroyed their world. Rising seas drowned their cities, and the survivors had to start over, building new civilizations from the fragments of the old. We face similar challenges today. Climate change is melting ice caps and raising sea levels. Coastal cities house billions of people. If the waters rise as they did 12,000 years ago, modern civilization would face the same catastrophe that destroyed its predecessors. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the pre-flood valley civilizations. They're not just historical curiosities or archaeological mysteries. They're warnings, carved in stone and buried in sediment, telling us that no civilization is permanent, that nature can reclaim in decades what took millennia to build, and that forgetting the past condemns us to repeat it. The evidence lies beneath our feet and beneath our seas. In river valleys where cities have been built and rebuilt on the same sites for thousands of years. In underwater ruins that mark the drowned coastlines of the Ice Age world. In legends that preserve memories of catastrophes our ancestors survived. We're only beginning to understand the true scope of what was lost. Each new discovery, each underwater survey, each excavation that reaches the deepest layers reveals more evidence of the civilizations that came before. The pre-flood world was more sophisticated than we imagined, more extensive than we thought possible, and more completely destroyed than we wanted to believe. But it's not completely lost. Fragments survived. Knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The river valley civilizations that emerged after the flood carried forward the legacy of what came before, even if they didn't fully understand where that legacy came from. We are the inheritors of that legacy too. The knowledge we take for granted, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, might be far older than we think. Rediscoveries of things that were known and lost and known again across multiple cycles of civilization. Understanding the pre-flood valley civilizations means understanding our own past and possibly our future. It means recognizing that human history is far more complex than the simple narrative we've been taught. And it means acknowledging that beneath every ancient city, beneath every river valley, and beneath every sea, there might be evidence of worlds we've forgotten, civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history began. The water that gave life to these civilizations also took it away, but in doing so it preserved them, burying their remains in silt and sediment, protecting them for thousands of years until we developed the technology to find them again. Now, finally, we can begin to uncover the truth about the pre-flood valley civilizations, about who they were, what they knew, and what happened when their world drowned. The answers are waiting beneath the mud and water, waiting for us to ask the right questions and dig deep enough to find them. Rewriting the story of humanity. We began this journey with a simple question. What if the story we've been told about human civilization is wrong? After exploring 7 civilizations that mainstream science struggles to explain, after examining underwater cities, impossible stonework, advanced astronomical knowledge, and legends of catastrophic floods, we're left with an inescapable conclusion. The story is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in minor details. Fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Human civilization is not 5,000 years old. It's not a story of steady progress from primitive hunter-gatherers to the sophisticated societies of Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's not a simple linear progression from stone tools to bronze to iron to the modern age. The real story is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more tragic. It's a story of cycles, of civilizations rising to remarkable heights and then falling into oblivion. It's a story of knowledge gained and lost and painfully regained. It's a story of catastrophes that reset human progress and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments and memories. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Let's review what we've discovered. Beneath the oceans, at depths that place them above water during the Ice Age, lie structures that shouldn't exist according to conventional timelines. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan, the Gulf of Cambay ruins off India, the Cuban underwater formations, and countless other submerged sites all point to the same conclusion. Sophisticated human settlements existed during the last ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. These weren't primitive camps. The sonar images and underwater surveys show organized structures, geometric patterns, and evidence of planning and construction that requires social complexity and technical capability. When the Ice Age ended and the seas rose catastrophically, these settlements were destroyed, their inhabitants scattered or drowned, and their achievements buried beneath the waves. Only the most massive monuments had any chance of surviving, and even those are now so degraded and controversial that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge them as artificial. But they're there, waiting beneath the water, ready to rewrite history if we're willing to explore them properly and accept what we find. The ancient maps showing Antarctica without ice, showing coastlines as they appeared before the end of the Ice Age, prove that someone mapped the world when it was radically different from today. Someone had the capability for transoceanic navigation, the knowledge of cartography, and the organizational capacity to conduct surveys of entire continents. The conventional explanation that these maps are errors or fabrications doesn't withstand scrutiny. The geographical features they show correspond too precisely with subglacial topography we only discovered with modern technology. The probability of multiple independent cartographers accidentally creating maps that match features we couldn't see until the 20th century is effectively zero. The only reasonable explanation is that the maps are copies of much older originals, created by a civilization with advanced navigational and cartographic capabilities. A civilization that existed when Antarctica was at least partially ice-free, before the climate shifted and buried the continent under miles of glaciers. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey stands as physical proof that 12,000 years ago, humans were capable of remarkable feats. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations, supposedly happened
after Göbekli Tepe was built.
Yet, there it is. Massive stone pillars carved with sophisticated reliefs arranged in geometrically precise circles, demonstrating astronomical knowledge that predates any known civilization. The builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed capabilities that break all the rules. They understood geometry, astronomy, and engineering. They could organize large-scale labor projects. They carved stone with skill that rivals much later civilizations. And they did all this before agriculture, before writing, before any of the markers we use to define civilization. Where did their knowledge come from? The only logical answer is that they inherited it, that they were descendants of an even earlier culture that had developed these capabilities long before. The Younger Dryas catastrophe, which began around 10,900 BCE, might have destroyed that earlier culture, leaving only survivors who tried to preserve and transmit the old knowledge by building monuments like Göbekli Tepe. The precision stonework at Pumapunku in Bolivia presents challenges that modern engineers openly admit they would struggle to meet. 100-ton blocks of the hardest stone, cut with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, fitted with interlocking joints that rival modern machining standards. This level of precision shouldn't exist in any ancient culture, let alone one supposedly working with copper chisels and stone hammers. Either we're missing critical information about ancient technologies and techniques, or the people who created the most precisely cut stones at Pumapunku had capabilities we haven't acknowledged. The possibility that the site is far older than conventionally dated, that it was built by a more advanced culture and later reused by peoples who couldn't match the original engineering, deserves serious consideration. The lost civilization of the Sahara proves that entire worlds can be erased by climate change. For thousands of years, the Sahara was green, supporting a sophisticated culture that created art, built ceremonial centers, and developed technologies that their descendants carried to the Nile Valley and other regions when the desert advanced. This civilization covered an area larger than any other ancient culture. It persisted for millennia. And then, climate change destroyed it so completely that we only discovered its existence in the 20th century. If this can happen to a civilization spanning millions of square miles, it can happen to any civilization, including our own. The Pacific Ring megalith builders accomplished feats of navigation and engineering that challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean without modern instruments. They carved and moved stones weighing dozens of tons on tiny islands with limited populations and resources. They demonstrated knowledge of astronomy and geometry that seems disproportionate to their supposed technological level. The similarities between megalithic sites separated by vast distances suggest either widespread cultural connections we don't understand or inheritance from a common source. Could there have been an earlier Pacific civilization that was destroyed, with survivors carrying their knowledge to various islands where later peoples built monuments based on inherited techniques? Finally, the pre-flood valley civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China all show the same pattern. Sudden emergence with advanced capabilities already in place. Legends of floods and earlier ages, and traces beneath their cities of older, sometimes more sophisticated construction. These civilizations weren't starting from scratch. They were rebuilding. Founded by refugees from coastal settlements destroyed when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The survivors brought with them knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, allowing them to create what appear to be suddenly advanced civilizations. All these pieces fit together into a coherent picture. A picture that's radically different from the conventional narrative, but that explains the anomalies, the impossible artifacts, and the mysteries that mainstream archaeology struggles to address. The picture looks like this. During the last ice age and the period immediately preceding it, human civilization was more advanced than we've acknowledged. Sophisticated cultures existed along coastlines that are now underwater. They had transoceanic navigation, advanced astronomy, sophisticated architecture and engineering, and social complexity comparable to later historical civilizations. Around 10,900 BCE, a catastrophic event occurred. Whether it was a comet impact, as some researchers suggest, or simply the beginning of rapid climate change, the effect was devastating. The Younger Dryas period brought Ice Age conditions back for over 1,000 years. Many coastal settlements were destroyed. Populations crashed. Knowledge was lost. When the climate finally warmed and the Ice Age truly ended around 9600 BCE, the melting was catastrophic. Sea levels rose over 300 feet in a geological instant. The coastal civilizations that had survived the Younger Dryas were drowned. Vast areas of habitable land were submerged. Survivors fled inland, to higher ground, carrying whatever they could save of their culture's knowledge and achievements. These refugees established new settlements in river valleys and inland locations that hadn't been flooded. Places like Göbekli Tepe might represent their attempts to preserve astronomical and architectural knowledge in permanent stone monuments. The astronomical observations encoded at Göbekli Tepe might be recording the catastrophe itself, preserving for future generations the knowledge that death can come from the sky. Over the following millennia, as populations recovered and reorganized, new civilizations emerged. But they emerged with fragments of the old knowledge. Advanced astronomy inherited from Ice Age star watchers. Sophisticated engineering techniques preserved from the drowned coastal cities. Mathematical and geometrical understanding passed down through generations, even when its origins were forgotten. This explains why civilizations like Sumer, Egypt, and Harappa appear suddenly with advanced capabilities. They weren't inventing these things. They were remembering them, reconstructing knowledge that had been lost. The founding myths about gods or sages teaching civilization might be distorted memories of refugees from the flooded world, people who seemed impossibly advanced to the populations they encountered. It explains the global flood legends. They're not independent mythological inventions. They're cultural memories of real events. The catastrophic sea level rise that destroyed the Ice Age world. Every culture has flood stories, because every culture is descended from people who survived the flood. It explains the underwater ruins, the impossible maps, the advanced astronomical knowledge, and the precision engineering. All of it points back to a more sophisticated Ice Age civilization that was destroyed by climate catastrophe. Now, you might ask, if this civilization was so advanced, why don't we find more evidence? Where are the cities, the metal artifacts, the clear proof of advanced technology? The answer is sobering. We do find evidence, constantly, but it's either ignored, explained away, or buried beneath places we can't easily excavate.
Most of the Ice Age world is now underwater, and we've explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. The sites that are underwater are largely inaccessible to standard archaeology. The ones that are on land are often buried under dozens of feet of sediment or located in regions that are difficult to excavate.
Moreover, advanced technology doesn't necessarily mean technology like ours. A civilization could be sophisticated in astronomy, navigation, mathematics, architecture, and social organization without developing electronics or internal combustion engines. If their technology was based on materials that decompose, wood, rope, leather, organic compounds, almost nothing would survive 12,000 years except stone monuments. The metals they used would corrode away to nothing. Any writings on perishable materials would be long gone. Only their most massive stone constructions would endure, and even those would be so weathered and degraded that recognizing them as artificial would be difficult. But the real reason we don't find more evidence is that we're not looking properly. Archaeology as a discipline is constrained by paradigms and assumptions. Sites that don't fit the established timeline are explained away, dated differently, or simply ignored. Researchers who challenge the conventional narrative are marginalized or ridiculed. Funding goes to excavations that confirm what we already believe, not to explorations that might overturn established theories. This is beginning to change. New technologies are making underwater archaeology more feasible. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar are revealing sites that were previously hidden. And younger archaeologists, less invested in defending the old paradigms, are more willing to consider alternative interpretations. But change is slow. The archaeological establishment has built careers and reputations on the conventional timeline. Admitting it's wrong would mean acknowledging that generations of scholars missed something enormous. That's psychologically difficult and professionally dangerous. Yet the evidence keeps mounting. Every year brings new discoveries that don't fit the narrative. Underwater structures in new locations, older dates for known sites, artifacts that demonstrate capabilities supposedly didn't exist. The dam is cracking, and eventually it will break. When it does, when mainstream archaeology finally accepts that human civilization is far older than acknowledged, the implications will be profound. First, it will change how we understand human potential. We'll recognize that ancient peoples weren't primitive or intellectually inferior. They were as capable as we are, achieving remarkable things with different tools and technologies. The idea of progress as an inevitable upward trajectory will be replaced by understanding that civilization is fragile and cyclical. Second, it will change how we think about our own civilization. If advanced cultures have risen and fallen before, if catastrophes have reset human progress multiple times, then we're not as secure as we think. Our knowledge, our technology, our achievements could be lost just as completely as those of our ancestors. This should make us humble and cautious about threats like climate change, nuclear war, or environmental destruction. Third, it will force us to reconsider indigenous knowledge and oral traditions. The legends we've dismissed as mythology might contain genuine historical information. Aboriginal Australians, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, and other indigenous peoples
might preserve cultural memories extending back thousands of years further than we've believed. Their stories deserve to be taken seriously as potential sources of historical information. Fourth, it will open entirely new fields of research. If there were advanced Ice Age civilizations, we need to find them, excavate them, and learn from them. The ocean floor holds cities and settlements we've never explored. The continental shelves, river deltas, and ancient coastlines all need systematic survey and excavation. This will require new technologies, new methods, and new resources.
Fifth, it will reveal that much of what we think we know about early civilizations might be wrong. The dates we've assigned, the origins we've assumed, the development sequences we've constructed might all need revision. This will be uncomfortable, but ultimately beneficial. Because truth, however inconvenient, is always better than comfortable falsehood. The 7 civilizations we've explored in this journey are just the beginning. There are almost certainly others waiting to be discovered, other sites that will challenge and expand our understanding. As underwater archaeology advances, as remote sensing improves, as we explore more thoroughly, we'll find more evidence of the forgotten world. And perhaps we'll find answers to the deepest questions. Who were these people really? What did they know? What did they achieve? And most importantly, what happened to them? The last question might be the most crucial, because their fate could be ours. They built civilizations that endured for thousands of years. They developed sophisticated knowledge and impressive capabilities. They seemed permanent and invincible. And then catastrophe struck. Climate changed. Seas rose. Their world ended. The survivors scattered, carrying fragments of knowledge that later peoples would struggle to understand and preserve. We face similar threats. Climate change is real and accelerating. Sea levels are rising. Coastal cities housing billions of people are at risk. If the ice caps melt as rapidly as they did at the end of the last ice age, modern civilization would face a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. Unlike our ancestors, we have the technology and knowledge to understand what's happening and potentially prevent the worst outcomes. But like them, we're constrained by short-term thinking, political divisions, and the difficulty of coordinating action at a global scale. The forgotten civilizations warn us. No matter how advanced, how powerful, how permanent we seem, we're vulnerable. Nature operates on scales beyond human control. The forces that destroyed the Ice Age world still exist and could destroy our world just as completely. But there's also hope in these stories. Humanity survived. After catastrophes that killed most of the population and destroyed most of civilization, we rebuilt. We preserved what knowledge we could. We started over. We've done it before, and if necessary, we could do it again. Perhaps the real lesson of the 7 lost civilizations is resilience. Human civilization is fragile, yes, but humanity itself is remarkably durable. We adapt, we survive, we persist. Even when everything seems lost, even when the world we know is destroyed, we find a way to continue. The monuments these civilizations left behind stand as testimony to human capability and human determination. They tell us that our ancestors achieved remarkable things, that knowledge and skill are not unique to modern humans, that civilization is an old human story, one we've told many times in many different ways. They also remind us to be humble. We're not the first advanced civilization, just the most recent. We're not discovering new knowledge so much as rediscovering things that were known before. The ancients looked up at the same stars, asked the same questions, and found answers we're still trying to understand. As we conclude this journey through humanity's forgotten past, we're left with both answers and mysteries. We've answered the question of whether advanced civilizations existed before recorded history. The evidence says yes, clearly and undeniably. But we're left with deeper mysteries. How advanced were they really? What specific knowledge did they possess? What were their beliefs, their stories, their understanding of the world? What did they call themselves? What languages did they speak? What happened in their final days when the waters rose and their world ended? These questions might never be fully answered.
Too much has been lost, too much destroyed, too much buried beneath oceans and sediment. But every excavation, every underwater survey, every new analysis brings us closer to understanding. The story of human civilization is being rewritten, slowly but inevitably. The 7 civilizations we've explored are forcing archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions and timelines. More discoveries will come, more evidence will emerge, and eventually, the truth will be undeniable. When that happens, when mainstream science finally accepts what the evidence has been telling us, we'll look back on this period as a turning point, the moment when humanity rediscovered its own past, the moment when we realized that we're part of a much longer, much more complex story than we imagined. That story isn't finished. We're still writing it, still building our own civilization, still reaching toward greater understanding and achievement. The difference is that now we know we're not the first. We know that others came before, built great things, and lost them to catastrophe. Armed with that knowledge, we can hopefully do better. We can learn from their failures and successes. We can recognize the threats that destroyed them and work to prevent similar catastrophes. We can preserve knowledge in ways that might survive even if our civilization falls, leaving clues for those who come after. Because if there's one certainty in human history, it's that the cycle continues. Civilizations rise and fall. Knowledge is gained and lost. Catastrophes happen. But humanity endures, adapting and rebuilding, carrying forward the torch of consciousness and civilization, no matter what obstacles we face. The 7 civilizations that science can't explain are no longer quite so mysterious. We understand now that they're part of a longer human story, evidence of capabilities and achievements from ages we thought were primitive.
They prove that we've been sophisticated far longer than acknowledged, and that the human journey toward understanding and mastery of our world began thousands of years before recorded history. These forgotten civilizations call to us across the millennia. They speak through silent stones and drowned cities, through impossible artifacts and ancient legends. Their message is both a warning and an inspiration. The warning? Civilizations can fall. Knowledge can be lost. Everything we've built could vanish. The inspiration? Humanity persists. We rebuild. We rediscover. We continue. As we face an uncertain future, threatened by climate change and other global challenges, perhaps we should listen to what the ancients are trying to tell us. They stood where we stand now, at the peak of their power, believing their civilization would last forever. They were wrong. Will we be too? Or will we learn from their fate, recognize the patterns, and break the cycle? The ruins beneath the waves, the monuments on distant hilltops, and the mysteries scattered across continents all wait for us to answer that question. They've been waiting for 12,000 years. They can wait a little longer, but the clock is ticking. The ice is melting. The seas are rising. And history, as these 7 lost civilizations remind us, has a tendency to repeat itself, unless we learn its lessons in time.